The sound hit before anyone understood what they were seeing. A full, open-handed slap. No hesitation, no warning. And Nurse Mara Denton's head snapped sideways hard enough to send her cap spinning off her head. Blood welled immediately from the corner of her lip and dripped in a thin line down her chin, falling in dark spots onto the polished floor of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center's emergency room in Crestfall, Montana. The man who did it, Preston Wolfe, CEO of Wolfe Defense Systems, net worth $4.2 billion, grabbed her by the collar of her scrubs and pulled her close enough that she could smell the bourbon underneath his expensive cologne. "Know your place," he said. Quiet, certain, like he was correcting a piece of furniture that had gotten in his way. 41 people witnessed it. Doctors, nurses, patients strapped to gurneys. A security guard who reached for his radio and then froze, his hand going still when he registered the suit the man was wearing. What none of them knew, what no one in Crestfall had known for 16 years, was that Mara Denton had once pulled 4 American military commanders out of a burning convoy while insurgents fired on her position from 3 directions simultaneously. She had survived things that would have destroyed most people completely. Preston Wolfe had absolutely no idea what he had just set in motion. If you're watching this story, please like, subscribe to my channel, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The emergency room at Hargrove Memorial never fully went quiet. It operated in cycles the way a machine did. Rotating staff, shifting noise levels, the same relentless fluorescent light overhead that made everyone look vaguely unwell regardless of whether they actually were. Mara had worked the night rotation for 3 years running, and she knew this building the way she knew her own hands. She knew which supply closet doors needed a shoulder to open. She knew which attending over-ordered imaging because he was scared of missing something, and which one could run a trauma assessment in under 4 minutes without breaking a sweat. She knew that Bay 7 had a curtain track that squealed when you pulled it too fast, and she had learned years ago to pull it slow. She was 39, medium height, lean in the way that came from 12-hour shifts on hard floors rather than any deliberate effort. She kept her dark brown hair in a braid that was always slightly coming undone by hour 5. There was a small scar along her left jawline that most people assumed was from a childhood fall. She had never told anyone otherwise. She'd been a registered nurse at Hargrove Memorial for 6 years. Before that, 2 years at a smaller hospital in Billings while she found her footing. Before that was a period of her life she kept filed away in a part of herself she did not open at work, or at dinner, or most nights when she was trying to sleep. She had gotten reasonably good at keeping it closed. The night Preston Wolfe arrived, Mara was already dealing with 3 simultaneous situations, which was not unusual. A 44-year-old man in Bay 2 with chest pressure she wasn't satisfied with yet. A teenager in Bay 5 with a laceration above his eye that was going to need more stitches than his mother was prepared for. And a 7-year-old girl named Lily Farrow in Bay 9 who had come in 40 minutes ago with what her father described as a stomachache and what Mara had immediately suspected was something significantly worse. Lily was the one Mara was thinking about when Preston Wolfe walked through the main entrance. She had clocked him on her way past the waiting area. Hard not to, because he walked the way wealthy men sometimes did in public spaces, with the specific confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been made to wait for anything. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack. Behind him, a step back and slightly to his left, was a boy of maybe 12 or 13, with dark circles under his eyes, and his arms crossed tight over his chest. The boy looked miserable in the way that was specifically different from being sick. He looked like someone bracing for impact. Mara cataloged this and kept moving toward Bay 9. Lily Farrow was lying very still in a way that children her age almost never did in emergency rooms. Most kids that age cried or squirmed or asked when they could go home. Lily was doing none of those things. Her color was off, a grayish undertone beneath her normal complexion that Mara had learned over years not to dismiss. Her abdomen was rigid when Mara pressed it gently, and the girl's breath caught in a way that told her everything she needed to know about where the pain was concentrated. "Hey, sweetheart," Mara said, keeping her voice even and calm. "Can you point with one finger to where it hurts the most?" Lily moved her finger slowly to the lower right quadrant of her abdomen. Mara straightened up and turned to the girl's father, who was standing at the bedside, looking the way parents looked when they were trying very hard not to appear as frightened as they actually were. I'm going to get Dr. Okafor in here in the next few minutes, Mara said. I want to move some things around so we can get an ultrasound on her quickly. We're going to take good care of her, okay? The father nodded. Okay. Thank you. Mara was already moving toward the nursing station when she heard the voice behind her, loud, clipped, accustomed to immediate results. Hey, nurse! She turned. Preston Wolfe was standing 10 feet away with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man who had not gotten something he wanted and was not accustomed to the experience. His son stood a half step behind him, not making eye contact with anyone. My son needs to be seen, Wolfe said. We've been waiting 20 minutes. I understand, Mr. Wolfe, Preston Wolfe. He said it the way some people stated facts they assumed would produce an immediate reaction. I'd like someone to attend to my son now. Mr. Wolfe, I'll make sure someone gets to him as soon as possible. We're triaging based on... I didn't ask about your triage system. His voice dropped. Not softer, but more pointed. I asked for someone to see my son. Now. Mara looked at the boy. He had what appeared to be a sprained wrist. His right arm was held carefully against his body, and there was visible swelling at the joint. It was real, and it needed attention, and it was not, by any clinical measure, immediately life-threatening. The 7-year-old in Bay 9 was a different calculation entirely. Sir, we have a pediatric patient in potential distress right now who I need to get to. Your son's injury is being noted, and someone will be with him shortly. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you. That's not acceptable. I understand you're frustrated. It's still the answer. She turned to go. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Wolfe crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and his hand came around in a hard arc that connected with the left side of her face before her body had fully registered he was moving. The impact rocked her sideways, and she grabbed the edge of the nursing station counter to keep her balance. Her cap landed somewhere to her left. She tasted blood immediately. The inside of her cheek had caught against her teeth. The room went completely still. Not the gradual quiet of people slowly noticing something. The immediate, full-stop silence of 41 people processing something they could not quite believe they had just seen. Wolfe grabbed the collar of her scrubs with one hand, twisting the fabric until it pulled against the back of her neck. Know your place, he said. Very quiet. Very certain. Mara did not move. She stood there with blood in her mouth and her heart rate doing something she recognized from a very long time ago. Not spiking with panic, but dropping into a steady, cold rhythm she hadn't felt in 16 years. Her vision sharpened rather than blurred. The edges of the room became very clear. She looked at Preston Wolfe directly. He was still holding her collar. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. The look of a man who had said an unsatisfying thing and was waiting for it to land properly. It didn't land the way he expected. Mara reached up and removed his hand from her collar the way you'd move an object that had been left in the wrong place. She straightened her scrub top. She picked up her cap from the floor. And then she walked away from him without another word, moving toward Bay 9 at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. Behind her, someone in the waiting area let out a shaky breath. A monitor beeped twice. The security guard finally got on his radio, his voice low and uncertain. Wolfe stood in the middle of the emergency room floor with his son behind him and watched the nurse he had just struck walk away from him as if he were weather. She had decided to stop accounting for. Inside Bay 9, Mara put her cap back on and let out one slow breath through her nose. Her hands were completely steady when she picked up Lily Farrow's chart. She pressed the call button for Dr. Okafor. I need you in 9, she said when he answered. Pediatric, 7 years old. I think we're looking at a hot appendix. She needs imaging yesterday. On my way. She stayed with Lily while she waited, talking to the girl in the unhurried way she had developed over years of working with frightened children. She asked Lily about school, about what grade she was in, about whether she had a dog. Lily said she had a dog named Biscuit, who was very fat and snored loudly enough that sometimes she could hear him from the hallway. Mara laughed, genuinely, not the performed kind, and said that sounded like an excellent dog. Lily managed a small smile. Dr. Okafor arrived, assessed Lily in under 3 minutes, and confirmed what Mara had already known. They had her moving toward imaging within 10 minutes of that conversation. The father followed alongside the gurney with his hand on his daughter's ankle, the one point of contact he could maintain without getting in the way. Mara watched them go and then stood in the corridor for a moment doing a quiet internal inventory. Her face ached along the left cheekbone in a dull, radiating way. Her lip had stopped bleeding but had swollen slightly. Her neck was sore where the collar had pulled. She went to the break room, which was empty at that hour, and stood at the sink and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above it. The bruising was already beginning to form along her cheekbone, a dark smudge that would be fully visible by morning. Her lip was split at the corner, not badly, but enough. She looked at herself for a long moment. Then she opened her locker and took out her personal cell phone and found a number she had not dialed in 16 years. She had never deleted it. She wasn't entirely sure why. Some things you kept the way you kept a scar, not as a reminder of the damage, but as evidence that you had survived it. She stared at the number for a moment. Then she pressed call. It rang 4 times. She had almost decided no one was going to answer when the line connected, and a voice she recognized immediately said simply, "Yes." "This is Denton," she said. "Archangel 7. A pause. 3 full seconds of silence on the other end of the line. "Mara Denton." The voice was different than she remembered. Older, rougher at the edges. But the cadence was the same, careful, measured. "It's been a long time." "It has." "Where are you?" "Crestfall, Montana. I'm a nurse at Hargrove Memorial." Another pause, briefer this time. "What do you need?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I just needed someone to know I called. Whatever comes next from it, I'll handle my end." "Understood." The voice went quiet for a moment. "Are you hurt?" She looked at her reflection again. The bruise was darkening quickly. "Nothing serious," she said. "Mara." "I'm fine." "Okay." A breath. "Keep this line open." She hung up and stood in the break room for another 30 seconds, alone in the buzzing quiet of the hospital at 2 in the morning. Then she put the phone in her pocket, straightened her cap, and walked back out into the emergency room. The night was not finished with her yet. Out in the main bay, 2 of Crestfall's city police officers had arrived and were speaking with a hospital administrator named Douglas Frey, who had materialized from somewhere upstairs with the specific energy of a man who had been wakened from sleep and was trying to manage damage before he understood its shape. Frey was 48, thickly built, with the permanent expression of someone calculating risk. He was the kind of administrator who processed incidents primarily through the lens of institutional liability, and Mara had always found him exhausting. Preston Wolfe was still there. He had relocated to one of the chairs near the main entrance and was on his phone, speaking in a low, fast voice to someone who, based on the fragments Mara caught as she passed, was a lawyer. His son sat 2 chairs away with his wrist held carefully against his chest, staring at the floor. The boy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. One of the officers, young, female, with a dark ponytail and an expression that hadn't fully committed to neutral, approached Mara as she came back into the main bay. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Trevino. We're here about an incident involving a patient's family member. Can you tell me what happened?" "Yes," Mara said. She told her. She told it without embellishment and without editorializing, in the flat sequential language she'd used for years when giving medical reports. This happened, then this happened, then this. She described the slap. She described the grip on her collar. She described what Wolfe had said and the exact volume at which he'd said it. She told Trevino there were 41 people in the room at the time. Trevino wrote it down, her pen moving quickly. "Are you willing to file a formal complaint?" "Yes." "And you'd be willing to testify to this if it went further?" Mara looked at her steadily. "Yes." Trevino nodded, glancing toward where Douglas Frey was still speaking with her partner near the nursing station. Something moved through her expression briefly. Not quite sympathy, but something close to it. "We're going to want a full statement tonight if you're able." "I'm able." Across the room, Frey had noticed this exchange and was now moving toward them with the particular purposeful walk of someone who intended to insert themselves into a conversation. He arrived at Mara's left side and positioned himself slightly between her and the officer in the way people sometimes did when they wanted to control the shape of a discussion without appearing to. "Officer Trevino, I want to assure you that the hospital takes any incident involving our staff extremely seriously." He turned to Mara with a careful, managed expression. "Mara, can I speak with you for a moment privately before you—" "I'm in the middle of giving a statement," Mara said. "Of course, of course." Frey smiled, and it was the smile of a man rerouting quickly. I just want to make sure I want to make sure this is handled appropriately. I believe it is, Mara said. She turned back to Trevino and continued her account. Frey stayed where he was for a moment, then drifted away toward Wolfe's corner of the room. Mara noted this and kept it noted and said nothing about it. By the time she had finished her statement and returned to the patient floor, it was after 3 in the morning. Lily Farrow was out of imaging, and the results had confirmed what Mara already knew. The appendix was inflamed, bordering on critical, and the surgical team was being called in. It was the kind of case where 45 minutes in the wrong direction would have changed the outcome significantly. Mara checked in on the father, who was sitting in a chair outside the surgical prep area with his hands folded between his knees and his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He looked up when she came in. "How is she?" he asked, even though he'd already been told. People asked again because they needed to hear it more than once. "She's in very good hands," Mara said. "Dr. Okafor is one of the best I've worked with. She's going to be okay." He nodded slowly. "You knew," he said, "before the scans, before any of it. You looked at her for about 30 seconds and you knew." "I've been doing this a long time." "Thank you," he said. It came out rough, real, nothing performed about it. Mara nodded once and left him there. The rest of the shift moved the way shifts did when you were tired and holding something tightly inside your chest. Slowly, and then suddenly very fast. She had 2 more patients before dawn. She charted everything. She took her 15-minute break in the break room, sitting on the edge of the bench with her eyes closed. Not quite sleeping, doing the things she had learned in another life to do when she needed her body to recover without her mind being fully off. Monitoring with the volume down. She was aware, in the specific way she was aware of most things, that something had been set in motion tonight that was not going to stop at a police report. She didn't know its exact shape yet, but she had made the call, and she knew what that call had meant, and she knew the man on the other end of it well enough to understand that a certain kind of machinery did not get started, and then stop because it was inconvenient. She thought about Preston Wolfe in his expensive suit with his hand around her collar. She thought about his son's face. She thought about a little girl named Lily Farrow, whose father used words like "thank you" and meant every syllable. She was still thinking about all of this when the day shift began arriving at 6:15, and she gave her handoff report with clean, careful detail and clocked out into the gray early morning of Crestfall, Montana, where the sky was the color of old pewter and the temperature had dropped overnight to something that came with ice on the windshields. She sat in her car in the parking structure for a moment before starting it. Her phone buzzed. A text from the number she had called. No name, just a number that had sat unused in her contacts for 16 years. Wheels turning. "You'll want to be at work tomorrow." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she started her car. Across town, in the glass and steel offices of Wolfe Defense Systems Regional Headquarters, 2 attorneys were already building the narrative that Mara Denton was an unstable employee who had provoked a concerned father trying to get care for his injured child. They had the word of a billionaire, a team of crisis communications professionals, and the considerable advantage of having resources that dwarfed anything a night shift emergency room nurse could put together. What they did not have, what no one in that building had any reason to account for, was the knowledge of what Mara Denton had done 16 years ago in a burning convoy outside a city most Americans couldn't find on a map, and what she had meant to the 4 men she'd carried out of that fire, and what those 4 men did for a living now. By 7:15 that morning, Douglas Frey had called her personal cell phone twice. She let both calls go to voicemail. By 8, the hospital's head of HR had sent her an email with the subject line, "Confidential. Please review before your next shift." She read it in the parking lot of a diner where she'd stopped for coffee. The email was carefully worded, legally careful, every sentence double-layered with plausible meaning. But its essential content was this. The hospital was conducting a review, and pending that review, she was being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Mara read the email twice. She put her phone down and picked up her coffee and stared out the diner window at the street in front of her, where a city was waking up and going about its business in the specific oblivious way that cities did. She thought, they moved fast. Then she thought, so did I. She pulled up the message from the unlisted number again and read it once more. Wheels turning. You'll want to be at work tomorrow. Except now she wasn't going to be at work tomorrow. She was on administrative leave. Someone with significantly more money than her had made a phone call before the sun came up, and a hospital administrator had decided that the safest thing to do with an assault victim was to make her temporarily invisible. She thought about how she felt about this. She was surprised to find that what she felt, mostly, was very calm. She had been in situations before where the people with the most power made the first large move and expected that to be the end of it. She had been in situations before where the correct response was not the obvious one. She had learned, in conditions considerably more extreme than a Montana diner at 8 in the morning, that the difference between reacting and responding was approximately the difference between losing and not losing. She finished her coffee. She left a tip that was probably too large for what she'd ordered. She drove home through Crest Falls' quiet morning streets and went inside and showered and lay down on top of her made bed and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. And in the room around her, on the other side of the walls she'd built carefully over 16 years of civilian life, something she had kept very still for a very long time was beginning, quietly, to wake up. 3 states away, in an office that did not have its name on the building it occupied, a man in his early 60s sat at a desk and looked at the information that had been assembled for him in the 3 hours since a phone had rung at 2 in the morning. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades making decisions that mattered, and had learned to make them without the noise most people surrounded themselves with. He picked up a secure line. He dialed 2 numbers. Both picked up on the first ring. "You got my message," he said. "Yes," said the first voice. "Yes," said the second. "Then you know what we're doing," he said. A pause. "Crestfall, Montana," said the first voice, and something in it was different from professional. Something older, more personal. "I'll be there in 6 hours." "Make it 5, said the second voice. "I'm already closer." The man at the desk looked at the photograph in the file in front of him. A woman in combat fatigues, caught mid-movement, her face turned slightly away from the camera, her jaw set. The photograph was 16 years old. She looked younger. She also looked exactly the same. He set it down carefully. "Let me know when you land," he said, and hung up. He set it down carefully. "Let me know when you land," he said, and hung up. Mara woke at noon to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and 1 voicemail from her union representative, a woman named Patricia Solano, who spoke in the careful, hedged language of someone who had learned through experience not to make promises she couldn't keep. "Mara, it's Pat. I got the notice from HR about the administrative leave. I want you to call me before you do anything, before you talk to anyone from the hospital, before you respond to any emails, before anything. Just call me first, okay? Call me." Mara sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the message twice. Then she called Pat back. Pat answered on the second ring. "Good, you're up." "I'm up." "How's your face?" Mara touched her cheekbone. The bruise had fully established itself overnight, deep purple-blue along the bone, fading to yellow at the edges. Her lip was still swollen at the corner. "It looks worse than it feels." "I need you to go get it documented," Pat said. "Today, not tomorrow. A clinic, urgent care, somewhere that isn't Hargrove. Get photographs taken. Written documentation of the injury and how it occurred. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." "Good. Now tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning, in your own words," Mara told her. The same way she'd told Officer Trevino. Sequential, flat, exact. Pat interrupted twice to ask clarifying questions, both times about timing. She was quiet for a moment when Mara finished. "Okay," Pat said. "Here's what I know so far. The hospital received a call from Wolfe's legal team before 6 this morning. Before 6, Mara. While you were still finishing your shift." A pause. "Frey made the call on the leave before he consulted anyone in HR. I found that out 20 minutes ago." "That's not procedure." "No, it is not." Pat's voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "What he did is not protected by any policy I can find, and the reason he did it this fast is because someone told him to, and he didn't ask enough questions." Another pause. "I'm going to be honest with you. Wolfe has used this playbook before. There was an incident at a hotel in Denver 3 years ago. A catering staff member. It never made it past an NDA and a settlement." Mara said nothing. "That means he's done this before and walked away from it," Pat continued. His team knows how to move fast and make the other person feel like they're the problem. They're going to try to build a narrative that you were insubordinate, that you neglected his son's care, that the physical contact was somehow ambiguous or provoked. They already have someone from hospital administration willing to characterize it as a, and I'm quoting the email I received this morning, chaotic and unclear situation. But the 41 people were in the room, Mara said. I know, including 2 patients, a charge nurse, and a pediatric resident. I know, and I need all of them. Pat's voice tightened. I need you to write down every name you can remember who was present, every single one. And I need you to go get that documentation today. Can you do that? Yes. And Mara. A beat. Don't talk to anyone from the hospital. Not Frey, not HR, not anyone who calls from a Hargrove number. You talk to me first. Every time. Understood. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Outside her window, Crestfall was doing what it did in late morning, unhurried, indifferent, the mountains in the distance sitting under a flat gray sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow. She'd moved here 6 years ago because it was quiet and the hospital needed experienced night shift nurses, and because the mountains reminded her of places she had been that she was trying not to think about too carefully. She got up, washed her face carefully around the bruise, and got dressed. The urgent care clinic on Delaney Street was staffed by a physician's assistant named Marcus Webb, who had clearly had a long morning before Mara arrived, and was on his 2nd or 3rd coffee by the look of him. He was professional and thorough, and when he looked at her face, he did not ask leading questions, just documented what he observed with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that documentation sometimes mattered more than treatment. How did this occur? He asked, his pen ready. I was struck in the face by a patient's family member at Hargrove Memorial's emergency room at approximately 2:15 this morning. He wrote it down. He took photographs, 4 of them, from different angles, under the clinic's lighting that made the bruise look exactly as bad as it was. He noted the split at her lip and the swelling and the contusion along the cheekbone and the tenderness on palpation that suggested a bone bruise at minimum. Do you want me to refer you anywhere? He asked. No, she said. I just need the documentation. He gave it to her in a sealed envelope and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely managing it. I hope the situation gets resolved appropriately, he said. So do I, Mara said. She was back in her car by 2:15 in the afternoon. She sent Pat a message confirming she had the documentation and sat for a moment in the clinic parking lot, letting the engine run for the heat. Her phone had 3 more missed calls, 2 from the unrecognized number, 1 from Frey. She ignored the one from Frey. She looked at the unrecognized number for a long moment, then she called it. It rang once. Denton. The voice was different from the one she'd called at 2 in the morning. Female, with a flat Midwestern accent that had been mostly trained out, but not entirely. Mara placed it immediately, the way you placed voices you had spent significant time with in conditions that sharpened memory. Reyes, Mara said. A short breath, almost a laugh. Not quite. It's been a long time. You're the 2nd person to say that to me today. Probably won't be the last. Captain. Former captain, now presumably something else. Diana Reyes. Mara had served alongside her for 2 years before their assignments diverged. Reyes had been one of the sharpest operational minds she'd encountered in a career that had not been short on sharp operational minds. I got a call this morning, early. From? You know who from. Mara said nothing. I'm in Crestfall, Reyes said. I landed 40 minutes ago. I'm at a coffee place on... A pause, presumably looking at a sign. Calloway Street. You know it? Yes? Come when you can. Mara drove to Calloway Street. The coffee shop was the kind of place that had been there for 30 years and had no intention of updating its aesthetic. Dark wood, mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu behind the counter. Reyes was at a corner table with her back to the wall, which was such a reflex it had probably stopped being a conscious choice for her decades ago. She was 44 now, close-cropped gray at her temples that hadn't been there the last time Mara had seen her, wearing civilian clothes that she wore the way most people wore uniforms, like they had a function. She was drinking black coffee and watching the door. She looked at Mara's face when she sat down. The photographs in the file didn't do it justice, she said. There are photographs in a file. There's a file, Reyes said simply. There's been a file on Preston Wolfe for a while, not just ours. She wrapped both hands around her mug. How much do you know about Wolfe Defense Systems? I know they make defense contracts. I know he's worth more than $4 billion. I know he's the kind of man who hits women in emergency rooms because he's been told his whole life that consequence is something that applies to other people. Reyes nodded slowly. Wolfe Defense Systems has 12 active federal contracts worth a combined total of $3.8 billion. Most of them are in logistics and communications infrastructure. 3 of them are classified. She paused. 2 years ago, a forensic accountant at the Department of Defense flagged irregularities in the billing associated with those contracts. Not small irregularities. The kind that, if they hold up under full investigation, constitute federal fraud on a scale that… She stopped. It's significant. How significant? The kind that doesn't end with fines. Reyes looked at her steadily. The investigation has been running quietly for 18 months. It's been running quietly because the case needs to be airtight before it moves, and because Wolfe has relationships in enough places that a premature move gets buried. The team working it has been very careful. Mara absorbed this. And last night? Last night didn't change the investigation, Reyes said. But it changed the timeline. She set down her mug. What Wolfe did in that emergency room, in front of 41 witnesses, on a hospital's internal security cameras, to a decorated combat veteran who has spent 16 years building a civilian life and staying completely out of the way of every person who ever owed her anything. She stopped again, steadied herself in a way that was almost imperceptible. He handed us something. He handed you something, Mara said. I got a bruised cheekbone and a suspension. Administrative leave. The difference feels academic from where I'm sitting. Reyes almost smiled. Not quite. It won't for long. She looked at the table for a moment, and something passed through her expression that was more personal than professional. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. When have I not? Fair. A breath. Why did you call last night? You've been out for 16 years. You could have filed the police report and let it go through channels. Why the call? Mara thought about it. It was a fair question, and it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. Because I knew what he was going to do next, she said finally. I've seen men like that before. Not exactly like that, but the same architecture. They don't stop at one move. They go after everything. Your job, your reputation, your ability to keep working. And they do it fast before you can get organized. She paused. I knew that if I went into this alone, they would make me small enough to ignore. And I know what I am, Diana. I know what I can and can't fight by myself. Reyes nodded. And the call was your way of making sure you weren't alone. Yes. Okay. Reyes picked up her coffee. Then here's where we are. The people who got your call last night, and the people they called, have been in contact with the federal team working the Wolfe investigation since approximately 4 this morning. What you experienced last night is being treated as, she chose her words carefully, an accelerating factor, meaning they're moving faster. Meaning the timeline just got compressed significantly. She looked at Mara directly. But none of that helps you with the leave, and none of it helps you with the hospital. And I want to be honest with you that there's going to be a period, probably a short one, but a real one, where things look worse before they look better. His legal team is good. They've already made 2 calls to the hospital board this morning. I know, my union rep told me. Reyes raised an eyebrow fractionally. You already have union representation. I called her before I came here. The eyebrow settled. Good. A pause. Good. Don't talk to the hospital directly. Don't respond to anything from Wolfe's legal team. Let your union handle the employment side. She hesitated for just a moment. And maybe stay off social media. I don't use social media. Of course you don't. This time the almost smile actually made it. Some things don't change. They sat with that for a moment. The coffee shop moved around them. A pair of college students at a laptop, an older man reading a physical newspaper, the sound of the espresso machine in short, controlled bursts. How many people know about me? Mara asked. About the convoy. The classification level. The record itself is still restricted. Reyes looked at her carefully. But the people involved know, and the people they've told, selectively, over the years, know. A pause. You're not as invisible as you think, Mara. You never were. You just stayed quiet, and people respected that. But quiet doesn't mean gone. Mara thought about the photograph in the file she hadn't seen. Herself, 16 years younger, in a place she'd spent a long time trying to keep at a distance. What happens now? She asked. Now you go home, Reyes said. You let me do what I came here to do, and you try to sleep, which I know you won't manage, but you try. She stood up, dropping cash on the table without looking at the bill. And Mara, whatever Frey or anyone else from that hospital tells you in the next 48 hours, don't believe the version of yourself they're trying to sell you. Mara looked at her. I know who you are, Reyes said, not unkindly, but with the blunt certainty of someone who had watched her do something in a burning field that neither of them had ever spoken about in full. They don't. That's not your weakness right now. That's theirs. She left the coffee shop without looking back. Mara sat for another few minutes. She ordered a coffee she didn't particularly want and drank half of it. Then she drove home through Crest Falls' early afternoon streets and sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down every name she could remember from the emergency room the previous night. Staff, patients in waiting, the security guard, the pediatric resident, the 2 officers. She filled 2 pages. She was on the 3rd when her phone rang. Frey. Again. She stared at the name on the screen, let it ring 4 times, and then answered it. Mr. Frey. A short pause, like he was recalibrating. Mara, I'm glad I reached you. I've been trying. I know I was unavailable. Of course. He shifted into the voice he used when he wanted to appear reasonable, a particular modulation that Mara had cataloged over 6 years. I want you to know that the hospital takes this situation extremely seriously, and the administrative leave is purely procedural. It's protective. It protects you as much as anything else while the review is Douglas. She used his first name deliberately. I was assaulted at my workstation in front of 41 witnesses and security cameras, and I was suspended by 8 o'clock the same morning. That's what happened. I'm not going to call it something else because it's easier for the hospital. Silence. I'm not in a position to discuss the details of the leave decision over the phone, he said, stiffer now. What I was calling about, and I want to be clear this is a courtesy call, not an official communication, is to let you know that Mr. Wolfe's son did receive care last night. His wrist was treated, and Mr. Wolfe has expressed through his representatives a willingness to consider a resolution if, Mr. Frey, Mara said, my union representative has asked me to direct all communication about this matter through her office. I'm going to do that. Have a good afternoon. She hung up. She put the phone face down on the table and looked at the legal pad in front of her. She had 37 names so far. She kept writing. By 5 o'clock, she had completed the list, photographed it, and sent it to Pat. She had also received a long email from Wolfe's legal team, direct to her personal address, which meant someone at the hospital had provided it, that used the words regrettable misunderstanding 4 times in 7 paragraphs and contained, buried in the 5th paragraph, an offer of settlement contingent on her signing a non-disclosure agreement and withdrawing the police complaint. She forwarded it to Pat without responding to it. At 6, she ate something she couldn't have described in any detail afterward. Her body needed fuel and she provided it mechanically. And then she stood at her kitchen window and looked at Crestfall in the early evening. The streetlights were coming on. A few cars moved along the wet street. Snow had started at some point in the afternoon, light and indecisive, just enough to make the sidewalk shine. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from the unlisted number. The first one. The one she had called at 2 in the morning. Tomorrow morning. 900. Be at the hospital. She stared at the message. I'm on administrative leave, she typed back. They suspended me. The response came in under 30 seconds. I know, be there anyway. She set the phone down and looked at the wall of her kitchen for a long moment. Then she went to bed at 8 o'clock, which she hadn't done since she was a child, and lay in the dark with her eyes open and her mind running the kind of quiet, systematic review she'd learned to do in another life when the situation required it. What she knew, what she didn't know, what the variables were, what she could control and what she couldn't. She couldn't control what Wolfe's lawyers did next. She couldn't control what Frey decided to tell the hospital board. She couldn't control the shape of the federal investigation that Reyes had described, or how long it would take, or what it would look like when it moved. What she could control was whether she showed up. She closed her eyes. She slept at some point, though she didn't know when. What she knew was that she woke at 5:15 to her alarm, and the sense of something large and irreversible moving through the dark toward morning, the way weather moved sometimes. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel the pressure changing. She showered. She put on clothes that were not her scrubs. She was on administrative leave, after all. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, her good boots. She looked at her face in the mirror. The bruise was still there, still obvious, still the color of deep water. She left it exactly as it was. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and drank it, and watched the clock move from 6 to 7 to 7:45. At 8:30, she drove to Hargrove Memorial and parked in the staff lot out of habit, then caught herself and moved to the visitor lot and sat in the car. She did not know exactly what she was waiting for. She found out at 9:02. She heard it before she saw it, a deep rhythmic percussion that started as a low vibration she felt in the frame of the car before she identified it as sound. She looked up through the windshield at the morning sky over Crestfall and saw it. A Black Hawk helicopter. Not a news helicopter. Not a medical transport. A military Black Hawk, unmistakable in its lines. Coming in low from the northeast, descending toward the open green space on the hospital's south side that had occasionally been used as a landing area for emergency airlift. It came down with the purposeful precision of a machine flown by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly where they were going. The landing kicked up a small storm of dead winter grass and left it swirling in the rotor wash as the aircraft settled. Around the hospital, people had stopped moving. Parking lot, entrance, the path along the east side. Everyone within sight had gone still and was looking. A doctor with a coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth, two nurses near the side entrance with their phones already out, a maintenance worker leaning on his cart with his head tilted back. The rotors wound down. The side door opened. 3 men stepped out. They were in dress uniforms, full dress, not field dress, the kind worn for ceremonies and formal occasions and moments when the symbolism of what you were wearing needed to be unmistakable. They were older men, all of them, with a particular bearing that came not from effort, but from it having been so deeply ingrained that it was simply how their bodies moved through space. They did not look around at the people watching them. They walked with the unhurried deliberateness of people who had somewhere specific to be and had no doubt whatsoever about where that was. Mara sat in her car and watched them cross the parking lot. They were walking toward the entrance of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center's emergency room. Her hands were resting in her lap, and she noticed, with some distant part of herself, that they were completely still. Her phone buzzed. The unlisted number. Now, Mara. She got out of the car. She followed them inside. The emergency room at 9 in the morning was a different animal than at 2. Brighter, busier, the day shift fully established. A waiting room with 8 or 9 people in various states of patience and discomfort. The charge nurse at the main station was a man named Tom Byers, who had worked days at Hargrove for 11 years and who, at the moment Mara came through the door, was standing behind his station with an expression of complete bafflement directed at the 3 uniformed men who had just walked in ahead of her. "I'm sorry," Byers was saying. Can I help you? Are you looking for—" The man in the center, taller than the other 2, with silver hair and the face of someone who had spent decades in conditions that accelerated the timeline of a face, turned to look at the room. His eyes moved with the systematic efficiency of someone assessing a space, and they stopped when they found Mara in the doorway. He said her name. Denton. The room shifted. It wasn't a loud shift. Nobody moved dramatically, no one dropped anything. It was the specific atmospheric change of a space full of people who all stopped what they were doing at the same moment, because something had happened that their nervous systems registered as significant before their minds caught up with why. Mara walked forward through the middle of the emergency room. She was aware of people watching. She was aware of Tom Byers staring. She was aware, somewhere behind her, of Douglas Frey's voice starting to say something from the direction of the administrative corridor, something about authorized personnel and proper channels, and then stopping. She stopped in front of the 3 men. The one who had said her name looked at her face for a long moment, at the bruise, at the split lip, mostly healed now but still visible. He looked at it with an expression that went through several changes in a very short time, none of them comfortable. Then he straightened. and all three men, simultaneously, came to attention and saluted her. The emergency room went completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The specific silence of a space where every person in it has stopped breathing at the same moment. Mara stood there in her civilian clothes with a bruise across her cheekbone and held their gaze and did not look away. The tall man lowered his salute. When he spoke to the room. Not performing it, not projecting theater, just making certain that what he was saying was heard. "My name is General Raymond Ashford," he said. "United States Army, retired. The men beside me are General Carl Pruitt and Vice Admiral Stephen Holt." A pause, measured and deliberate. 16 years ago, a woman pulled all three of us out of a burning vehicle convoy under active fire. She sustained injuries doing it. She spent 11 days in a field hospital that we were not authorized to visit for security reasons, and by the time the restrictions lifted, she had already declined recognition and returned to civilian life. He paused again. "That woman is the nurse this hospital suspended yesterday morning." The silence held. Somewhere in the back of the room, a monitor beeped twice, and nobody looked at it. Ashford turned back to Mara. "We got your call," he said simply. And in the administrative corridor behind the nursing station, Douglas Frey had gone the specific color of a man who had made a decision at 6 in the morning that he was now understanding, fully and completely, he was going to spend a very long time explaining. And in the administrative corridor behind the nursing station, Douglas Frey had gone the specific color of a man who had made a decision at 6 in the morning that he was now understanding, fully and completely, he was going to spend a very long time explaining. Nobody moved for a long moment. The emergency room held its breath in the particular way that spaces did when something had just happened that rearranged the architecture of the room. Not physically, but in terms of who had weight and who didn't, who occupied the center of gravity and who was suddenly peripheral. Three men in full dress uniforms standing at attention in the middle of a Montana hospital emergency room was not a thing that had a precedent here, and the people watching it were processing it the way humans process things that didn't fit existing categories, slowly, with their bodies before their minds. Tom Byers was gripping the edge of the nursing station counter with both hands. He wasn't aware he was doing it. A woman in the waiting area with a child on her lap had her hand pressed flat against her mouth. The pediatric resident, a second-year named Garrett, who had been at Hargrove for 7 months and had seen Mara get slapped the night before and had stood there not knowing what to do about it, was standing in the doorway to the treatment corridor with his coffee cup hanging from his fingers at an angle that was going to spill it in approximately 4 seconds. It spilled. He didn't notice. Mara stood in the center of all of it and looked at Raymond Ashford and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't have named precisely. Not relief, not vindication, something older and more complicated than either of those. Something that had been kept very compressed for a very long time and was now, quietly and without drama, decompressing. "General," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that, not because steadiness was what she owed the room, but because it was what she owed herself. "I want to look at your face," Ashford said. It was not a question. She turned slightly toward the light. Let him look. The bruise had gone through its full overnight development. The center was almost black now, spreading purple-blue toward her temple and yellow-green at the outer edges. The split at her lip was scabbed and still slightly swollen. It was not a subtle injury. Ashford looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked away, toward the corridor where Douglas Frey was standing, and whatever Frey saw in that look made him take one involuntary step backward. Carl Pruitt, the shorter of the three generals, had said nothing yet. He was a compact man with a gray beard kept close and precise, and he had the specific quality of someone who processed everything before reacting to any of it. He was looking around the emergency room with methodical attention, taking inventory of the people, the space, the positions of things. Old habit, deeply ingrained. His eyes landed on the security camera mounted above the nursing station, and he looked at it for a moment with something that might have been satisfaction. Stephen Holt, the vice admiral, stepped slightly to Mara's left, which put him between her and the corridor where Frey was standing. It was a subtle positioning. It was not accidental. Frey found his voice. "I'm Douglas Frey, hospital administrator. I'm going to need to understand what's happening here and whether proper notification—" "Mr. Frey!" Ashford's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the specific carrying quality of a voice accustomed to being heard in conditions where volume was impossible. "We're not here to speak with you," Frey stopped. "We're here to speak with Mara Denton." Ashford turned back to her. "Is there somewhere we can sit?" "The family consultation room," Mara said. "Down the left corridor, second door." "Lead the way." She walked. They followed. And the emergency room watched all of it. Staff, patients, the woman with the child, the pediatric resident still holding his empty coffee cup, in a silence that lasted until the door to the consultation room closed behind them and then broke all at once into the overlapping sound of a dozen conversations starting simultaneously. The consultation room was small and functional. A round table, 6 chairs, a box of tissues on a side table that had been there so long its design was outdated, a window with frosted glass that let in diffuse light without a view. Mara had sat in this room with families more times than she could count and delivered information ranging from difficult to devastating. It smelled like industrial cleaner and, faintly, old coffee. All 4 of them sat. Ashford across from Mara, Pruitt to her left, Holt to her right, which put her at the center of a rough triangle, and she was aware of this arrangement in a way that felt less like a meeting and more like a debriefing, which she supposed was closer to what it actually was. Ashford set his cap on the table and folded his hands and looked at her. "What do you know about what's coming?" he asked. "I know there's a federal investigation into Wolfe Defense Systems, billing fraud on defense contracts." She paused. "I know it's been running for 18 months and they've been moving carefully." "Who told you?" "Reyes." Ashford and Pruitt exchanged a brief glance. Holt was watching Mara. "Diana Reyes has been embedded with the DOJ task force for 6 months, Pruitt said. It was the first time he'd spoken, and his voice was what she'd remembered, measured, slightly slower than you'd expect, the voice of someone who had learned that words cost something. "She's not officially associated with us in this context." "I didn't assume she was." Mara looked at Pruitt. "She came because I called, not because someone sent her." "Fair," Pruitt said. "What I don't know," Mara continued, "is the timeline, or what the move looks like when it happens, or what any of this has to do with me beyond the obvious." Ashford was quiet for a moment. Outside the frosted window, the muffled sounds of the hospital went on. The PA system calling a name, the distant rumble of a cart on linoleum, voices at a register she couldn't make out. "The investigation has enough to move," he said. "It has had enough for approximately 6 weeks. The delay has been about coordination, DOJ, DOD, the FBI field office, making sure when it goes completely and doesn't give anyone time to start moving money or destroying documents." He paused. "Last night accelerated the internal conversation about timing, significantly. Because of what he did to me. Because of what he did to you, on camera, in a hospital emergency room, in front of a room full of witnesses, and then because of what the hospital did by 7 the next morning." Ashford's jaw tightened slightly. "Wolfe has been careful for years. The fraud is real, but it's buried under layers of corporate structure and shell companies and lawyers who are very good at their jobs. But what he did last night, that's not buried, that's documented. That's on 3 different security camera angles. And the story of who you are, if it becomes part of the public record..." He stopped. "It changes the narrative," Mara said. "It changes everything about the narrative." He looked at her directly. "But that only matters if you're willing to let it become part of the record." The room went quiet in a different way. This was the actual center of it, she understood. This moment, this question, everything else arranged around it. She had spent 16 years building a life that was deliberately separate from who she had been. She had done it intentionally and without apology, because the person she'd been in that other life had paid prices she didn't talk about, and she had earned the right to be done with it. The anonymity was not an accident. It was a choice, sustained and maintained over years. What Ashford was asking her was whether she was willing to unmake it. She thought about Lily Farrow in Bay 9 with her hand on her abdomen and her careful finger pointing to where it hurt. She thought about Lily's father in the chair outside surgical prep with his hands folded. She thought about the settlement offer that had arrived in her email, buried in formal language, asking her to sign away the right to speak about what had happened in exchange for money and disappearance. She thought about the hotel in Denver 3 years ago, The catering staff member, the NDA. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Ashford didn't look relieved. He looked like he'd expected this and was still taking it seriously. "We need a formal statement on the assault. We need your cooperation with the federal case if it goes to the point of requiring witness testimony. We need you to not accept any settlement offer from Wolfe's legal team." He paused. "And we need you to be prepared for the fact that once this moves, your name is going to be attached to it. Your service record, your commendations, what happened in the convoy, it becomes part of the public case." "That's not a small ask," Pruitt said, "not as a challenge, as a statement of fact." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." She sat with it for a moment. The consultation room. The box of outdated tissues, the frosted light. "Okay," she said. Ashford nodded once. They spent the next 45 minutes working through specifics. Mara answered questions with the same flat precision she used for medical reporting. Exact times, exact words, exact sequences. Holt took notes in a small notebook, the kind with a hard cover, his writing fast and small. Pruitt asked clarifying questions twice, both times about Frey. What she knew about his relationship with Wolfe, whether there had been prior interactions she was aware of. She told them what she knew, which wasn't much, and told them clearly where her knowledge stopped, which they appreciated in the specific way that people who deal in information appreciated clean edges. When it was done, Ashford picked up his cap from the table and stood. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "In 2009, when the restriction on visiting you in the field hospital was lifted, we came." He looked at her with something she couldn't categorize, not quite guilt, but in that neighborhood. "You'd already been discharged and transferred. We were told you'd declined to be found." A pause. "I've wondered about that for a long time." Mara looked at him steadily. "I needed to be done," she said. "It wasn't about you. It wasn't about any of you." "I know." He nodded. "I just wanted you to know we came." She held his gaze for a moment, nodded once. They left the consultation room in the order they'd entered it. Mara first, then Ashford, Pruitt, and Holt behind. The corridor was empty except for Garrett, the pediatric resident, who had clearly been walking past for the third time in 30 minutes, and stopped when the door opened and looked immediately at the floor. The emergency room was not empty. It had in fact gotten fuller, not with new patients, but with staff who were finding reasons to be in the main bay. Nurses from the second floor who had come down on breaks that were perhaps slightly extended. 2 attending physicians who were studying clipboards with perhaps more focus than the clipboards warranted. The charge nurse Tom Byers, who had made no effort to pretend he was doing anything except standing at his station watching the corridor. When the 3 generals came back into the main bay, the room did the same thing it had done before. Recalibrated silently, redistributed its attention. Douglas Frey was back, positioned near the main entrance with a woman Mara didn't recognize, who had the careful professional blankness of someone from a legal or PR background. He watched them come in with the expression of a man running calculations and not liking the results. Ashford turned to the room. He didn't use a command voice. He didn't have to. "My name is General Raymond Ashford," he said, the same as before, but now with the specific weight of everything that had happened in the consultation room behind it. "The woman you know as your colleague Mara Denton served as a combat medical specialist with a classification level I'm not going to detail here. 16 years ago, she performed actions under fire that resulted in 4 people, including the men with me, being alive today." He paused. "She did this, and then she came home, and she became a nurse, and she's been doing that job at this hospital for 6 years. 3 nights ago, she was assaulted at her workstation while prioritizing a pediatric patient, and the following morning, she was suspended." Nobody in the room said anything. "I'm going to make one thing very clear." His voice was still even, still not loud. "What happened to this woman in this emergency room was an assault. What happened to her employment afterward was a consequence of someone making a very poor decision under pressure from someone with money." He looked directly at Frey for exactly 2 seconds. "Decisions have consequences. That's true for everyone." Frey's lawyer or PR person touched his arm and said something very quietly that Mara couldn't hear. Ashford turned back to Mara. "Thank you for your time," he said. Then, more quietly, just to her, "We'll be in touch. Don't go anywhere." I live here, she said. Something moved through his expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. I know. They left through the main entrance. Through the glass doors, Mara watched them cross the parking lot toward the south lawn where the Blackhawk was still sitting, its rotors now still, a maintenance tech from somewhere standing a respectful distance from it, and looking at it the way people looked at things that were impressive and slightly outside their normal frame of reference. The emergency room let out its breath, and then Tom Byers said, to no one in particular, "What in the actual—" and didn't finish the sentence, and someone behind Mara made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complicated, and the room started moving again the way rooms eventually had to. Mara went to the nursing station and stood there for a moment, not sure what she was doing exactly, just standing in a space she knew well, in a situation that had moved well outside the familiar. Byers looked at her. He was 53, big-framed, a grandfather twice over, a man who had seen a great deal in 11 years of day-shift emergency nursing and was not easily rattled. He was rattled now. "You okay?" he asked. "Honestly, not sure," she said. He nodded like this was a reasonable answer. "You want coffee?" "Real coffee, not the break room stuff. There's a thermos." "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, I'd take some." He poured it. She drank it standing at the station. Nobody bothered her. Several people looked at her differently than they had the day before, not with the careful avoidance of someone who had become a liability, but with something that hadn't been there when she was just the quiet night shift nurse with the braid that came undone. She noticed this and filed it and didn't perform anything in response to it. It wasn't something she wanted to encourage, the looking. It wasn't something she'd ever wanted. She was halfway through the coffee when her phone buzzed. Reyes. Hospital security has been contacted by Wolfe's team. They're asking for a copy of last night's footage. Hospital has 72 hours to comply or contest under current subpoena provisions. Mara typed back, "Does the federal team know?" They filed their own request this morning. Theirs takes precedence. Hospital counsel is going to figure that out in about an hour. She put the phone away. Across the room, Frey was still talking to his companion in a low, urgent voice. He glanced at Mara once during this conversation and then looked away quickly. The woman with him was on her phone now, moving toward the exit, her walk fast and purposeful. The next escalation came 47 minutes later, and it came from a direction Mara hadn't fully accounted for. She was in the break room. Byers had told her she could use the staff facilities while her leave status was being clarified, a small act of human decency she noted and appreciated, when Garrett knocked on the open door and stood in it with the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. Is this okay?" he asked. "Come in." He came in and sat down at the table across from her, and he had the look she had seen on residents before when they were about to say something that cost them something. Young face, tired eyes, the beginning of a beard that hadn't committed to itself yet. He was 28, maybe 29. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About last night." "Okay. When it happened, when he hit you, I was in the corridor, and I saw it. I saw the whole thing." He looked at the table. "And I didn't do anything. I stood there and I watched Frey come out, and I watched them put Wolfe in a chair and get him coffee, and I knew what they were doing, and I still didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I have student loans. I have a visa situation that's complicated, and my status here depends on the hospital." I told myself those were reasons, and then I spent the rest of my shift knowing they were excuses. Mara looked at him. He was genuinely uncomfortable, sitting with himself in a way that wasn't comfortable and not trying to make it look like it was. "I'm going to give a statement," he said. "Everything I saw. I spoke to Officer Trevino this morning before my shift, and I gave her a preliminary account. She said she'd follow up. I wanted you to know." Mara was quiet for a moment. "What changed?" she asked. Not accusing, actually asking. 3 generals flew a military helicopter to a hospital in Montana, he said, for a night shift nurse. He looked up. "I already knew you were someone worth standing up for. I just needed to stop being scared enough to do it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Meant it, didn't inflate it. He nodded and left. She sat in the break room alone for a few minutes after he left. The coffee Byers had given her had gone cold. She drank the rest of it anyway. What she didn't know, sitting in the break room at Hargrove Memorial on a Tuesday morning with a fading bruise on her face and her employment status technically unresolved, was that approximately 40 minutes later, Preston Wolfe was going to receive a phone call that would make the hair on the back of his neck stand up for the first time in his adult life. She didn't know this yet. But the day was moving with the particular momentum of things that had been held in place too long and were now going with a weight that accumulated as they went. At 11:15, Pat Solano called. "I need you to listen carefully," Pat said, and her voice had changed from the careful hedged register she used when navigating employment procedures. It was faster now, precise in a different way. "The hospital's external counsel just contacted me. They've received notification from the Department of Justice that Hargrove Memorial's internal security footage from the ER bay is subject to federal evidence preservation." Mara let this land. "Meaning the hospital can't alter or restrict access to it. Meaning the hospital cannot touch it, period, without federal authorization. Which also means Wolfe's legal team cannot get access through the hospital." A short breath. "Which means someone just took that footage out of play as an asset for his defense and locked it into the federal record." "How fast did that happen?" "The notification came in at 10:52. A pause. "Mara, this is moving. Whatever is happening on the federal side, it is moving right now. And the hospital's counsel is telling Douglas Frey something that I would give a significant amount of money to be in the room for." Mara stood up from the break room table and walked to the window. The parking lot below. A few cars. A bare-limbed tree at the edge of the lot, moving in cold wind. "What about my leave?" "That's the other thing." Pat's voice shifted again. "I received a call 30 minutes ago from Hargrove's HR director. Not Frey, the actual HR director, Linda Marsh, who I don't think was consulted when Frey made the leave decision, based on the tone of this conversation. She wants to schedule a call for this afternoon to discuss the status of your administrative leave." "That's a change." "It's a significant change. 2 days ago, they were talking about a review process that could take weeks. Now they want to call this afternoon." A short pause. "I think someone explained to someone else what the optics look like when you suspend an assault victim and simultaneously obstruct a federal evidence request. I think that explanation happened this morning." Mara was quiet, looking at the bare tree. "How are you holding up?" Pat asked, and it was different from her professional voice. Shorter, more direct, the question of a person talking to another person. "I'm okay," Mara said. "I'm standing in the break room of the hospital I'm suspended from, drinking cold coffee, and apparently federal things are happening in ways I don't fully understand. But I'm okay." "Good. Keep the phone on. I'll call you before the 3 o'clock. She hung up. Mara stood at the break room window for another moment. Then she went back to the nursing station. Not because she was cleared to work, just because the break room felt too small, and she knew this floor and it was where she thought most clearly. At 12:41, something happened that none of the morning's events had prepared her for. The elevator at the end of the main corridor opened, and out of it came a boy. He was 12 or 13, in a padded jacket and dark jeans, his right wrist wrapped in the brace the ER had put on it the night before. He was alone, which she registered immediately. No adults, no escort, alone in the way that was either very confident or very scared, and occasionally both. It was Preston Wolfe's son. He walked toward the nursing station with the specific, careful purposefulness of a child who has decided to do something and is trying not to let themselves reconsider it before they do it. He had his father's coloring and bone structure and nothing else about his father that she could identify. He stopped at the station, looked at Mara. She could see him recognizing her. The bruise, the split lip, the person his father had grabbed by the collar in front of him. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was still in the in-between stage, not quite broken into its adult register. "If that's okay." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Eli," he said. "Okay, Eli." She came around the side of the station. "Come on." She took him to the consultation room, the same one, the tissues, the frosted glass, and sat across from him and waited. He had his hands flat on the table, and she could see him steadying himself, and she recognized this. The act of making yourself stay inside a hard thing instead of retreating from it. She had seen it in combat, and she had seen it in hospital corridors, and it looked the same in a 13-year-old as it did in adults. "My dad's lawyers are saying you did something wrong," he said. "That you didn't treat me fast enough, that you were being— they have a word for it, I forget, but it means like you were being unprofessional." "Insubordinate," Mara said. "Yeah, that one." He looked at the table. "That's not what happened." "No," she said. "It's not." "There was a little girl," he said. "I heard you say something to someone about a little girl. My wrist hurt, but I could move my fingers, and I've broken my wrist before, on my left side when I was 9. I know what a broken wrist feels like." He paused. "It wasn't that." Mara waited. "He shouldn't have done what he did," Eli said. It came out more evenly than she expected, like he'd said it to himself many times before saying it to her. "He shouldn't have." And the part where he stopped. His jaw tightened in a way she recognized now because she had been looking at the same jaw for the past 30 seconds. "The part where he grabbed you. That was— I'm sorry. I know it doesn't help. I know that I'm 13 and my being sorry doesn't change anything. But I wanted to say it to you and not just think it." Mara sat across from this boy and thought about the night shift emergency room and the specific kind of loneliness of being small in a situation where all the adults were either doing the wrong thing or doing nothing. And she felt something in her chest go tight and then loosen. "It does help," she said. "It actually does." He looked up. "The little girl is going to be okay," she added. "She had surgery last night. It went well." Something crossed his face, relief, complicated and real. "Does your father know you're here?" Mara asked. "No." He said it without hesitation. "Eli," she kept her voice even, "I have to be honest with you. This is a complicated situation that involves lawyers and your father, and I'm not sure you being here helps anything legally. I talked to a police officer this morning," he said. "I called the non-emergency number and asked for the officer who came last night. Officer Trevino. I talked to her for 20 minutes. He looked at Mara steadily. "I already told her what I saw. Everything." The consultation room was very quiet. Mara looked at the boy across the table from her. This 13-year-old with his father's face and apparently his own entirely different internal structure, and understood that the morning had just shifted again, in a direction and with a weight that Preston Wolfe's lawyers were not going to enjoy accounting for. "Okay," she said carefully. "Okay. Is that bad?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's not bad." What she was thinking, what she did not say to the boy across from her, was that the case against his father, which had been building for 18 months on the architecture of financial records and classified billing documents, had just acquired something that no amount of legal maneuvering could easily neutralize: his own son as a witness. Her phone buzzed on the table between them. "Reyes." She looked at the screen and then at Eli. "I need to take this for a moment," she said. "Can you wait here?" He nodded. She stepped into the corridor and answered. "Where are you?" Reyes said without preamble. "Consultation room. Wolfe's son just gave a witness statement to Officer Trevino." A short silence. "His son," Reyes said. "He's 13. He came here by himself. He'd already called Trevino before he came." Mara kept her voice low. "He saw everything." Another silence, longer. "Mara." Reyes's voice had the quality it got when she was processing multiple things simultaneously. "Are you somewhere that's secure right now?" "I'm in a hospital corridor." "Okay. Listen to me. In the last hour, Wolfe's chief financial officer filed a voluntary cooperation agreement with the DOJ task force. A pause that had weight to it. Which means someone inside Wolfe Defense Systems just decided that getting ahead of this was better than going down with it. Mara stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear, and the consultation room door closed behind her and Eli Wolfe sitting on the other side of it. "How fast is this moving?" she asked. "Faster than any of us planned," Reyes said. "Mara." Another pause, the kind where something was being decided about how much to say. "The arrest warrant application was filed this morning, 40 minutes ago." The corridor was very still. "They're moving today?" Mara said. "They're trying to move today." Reyes's voice was careful, exact. "There's a timing issue. Wolfe's legal team has been making calls all morning. They know something is happening even if they don't know the full shape of it yet. If they get him into a private flight before... She stopped. The sound that came through the phone next was brief and unmistakable. Background noise shifting, someone's voice on another line, Reyes saying something sharply to someone who wasn't Mara. "I have to go," Reyes said. "Reyes, stay at the hospital," she said. "Don't leave the building." The line went dead. Mara stood in the corridor with the dead phone and the frosted glass light coming through the consultation room window, and the sound of the hospital going on around her with its characteristic indifference to whatever was happening in the human lives that moved through it. She thought, "They're trying to move today." She thought, "If they don't get him in time." She pushed the door open and went back into the consultation room. Eli Wolfe was sitting exactly where she'd left him, his wrapped wrist resting on the table, looking at the wall with an expression she recognized. Not fear exactly, but the specific state of someone who has done something irreversible and is sitting inside the understanding of that. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Mara sat down across from him. She thought about what Reyes had said. She thought about a private flight. She thought about a man with $4.2 billion and very good lawyers and 16 years of practice at making consequences not reach him. "Eli," she said, "when you left this morning, do you know where your father was?" The boy looked at her. His expression changed. And in that change, in the specific shift from neutral to something she couldn't read yet, Mara felt the floor of the situation tilt beneath her in a way that meant something was wrong, or about to be, and that whatever was coming next was not going to be something any of the morning's momentum had accounted for. And in that change, in the specific shift from neutral to something she couldn't read yet, Mara felt the floor of the situation tilt beneath her in a way that meant something was wrong, or about to be, and that whatever was coming next was not going to be something any of the morning's momentum had accounted for. Eli looked at the table. It was a small movement, his eyes dropping, his shoulders doing something that was not quite a flinch, but Mara had spent enough years reading bodies under pressure to know what involuntary looked like versus performed. "Eli," she kept her voice the same, level, unhurried. "Where was your father when you left this morning?" "He was on the phone," the boy said. "He's been on the phone since about 5. I heard him when I got up." A pause. "He didn't know I was leaving. I didn't tell him." "What was he talking about? Could you hear?" Eli looked up. "He said Aspen." He said it like he was handing her something whose weight he didn't fully understand. He said Aspen, and then he said Tuesday afternoon, and then he told whoever it was to make sure the hangar was ready. The hangar. Mara stood up before she'd made a conscious decision to stand. She was already moving toward the door with her phone in her hand when Eli said, "Is he in trouble?" She stopped, turned back, looked at the boy, at his face, which was carrying about 14 different things and managing none of them easily. "Yes," she said, because he deserved the truth, and she wasn't going to perform something softer at him. "He is." Eli nodded slowly, like this was information he had been holding space for without knowing its exact shape. "Okay," he said quietly. She left him there and stepped into the corridor and called Reyes. It went to voicemail on the first ring, which meant Reyes was on another call, or couldn't pick up, which was worse. She called the unlisted number instead. Ashford answered on the second ring. "Aspen," she said. "He's heading for Aspen. Private hangar, Tuesday afternoon. That's today. That's this afternoon. He's trying to run." A brief silence. Then, "How certain?" "His son overheard the call at 5 this morning." Another silence, shorter. "I'll make the call. Stay where you are." He was gone. She stood in the corridor with her phone in her hand and her mind running the calculation she always ran when variables shifted. What was fixed, what was moving, what she could affect and what she couldn't. The warrant application had been filed. The CFO had flipped. The footage was locked into federal evidence preservation. The case was real and it was moving. But cases didn't matter if the subject was in the air over the Rockies with a destination that didn't have an extradition problem. She went back to the consultation room. Eli was sitting with both hands flat on the table, staring at nothing, doing the internal version of what she'd just been doing in the corridor. "You said he didn't know you were leaving," she said. "Right. Does he know where you are now?" Eli reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen showed 7 missed calls, all from the same contact he'd labeled simply Dad. He looked at the screen without expression. "He does now," he said. "Have you called him back?" "No," Mara thought. She thought about a 13-year-old who had walked into a hospital alone and given a witness statement and come here to say sorry and was now sitting in a consultation room with 7 missed calls from his father on his phone while that father was presumably making arrangements to leave the country. "I need you to stay here," she said. "Don't answer those calls. Don't leave this room. Can you do that?" "For how long?" "I don't know yet." Honest answer. He nodded. Then, "The little girl, Lily. You said she's okay." "She's going to be okay, yes." "Good." He said it simply, meaning it completely, and went back to looking at the table. Mara went to find Tom Byers. She found him at the nursing station running through chart updates with the focused efficiency that distinguished the good charge nurses from the rest. She waited until he looked up, then spoke quietly enough that it didn't carry. "There's a minor child in the consultation room. He needs to stay there, and he needs someone to check on him periodically. He's not a patient. It's complicated. Just make sure nobody bothers him and someone brings him something to drink." Byers looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had stopped asking for full explanations around 9 that morning. "Juice or water? Ask him. Okay?" He paused. "You doing all right?" "Working on it," she said. She had been back at the nursing station for 12 minutes when her phone buzzed with a text from the unlisted number. "Field office contacted. Crestfall Municipal Airport under watch. FBO at Aspen contacted through FAA. No departures authorized for Wolfe-registered aircraft pending federal hold." She read it twice. Then she looked at the time. It was 1:17 in the afternoon. Whatever was going to happen in the next few hours, and there was nothing she could do to make it faster or slower, and she had spent enough years in situations where the critical work was happening at a distance. She couldn't close to know that the correct response to this was not to chase it. The correct response was to stay inside the perimeter of what she could actually affect and let the pieces she'd put in motion move without her trying to steer them from the wrong position. She was thinking this when Douglas Frey appeared from the administrative corridor at 1:22 and walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision and was committed to delivering it before he lost his nerve. He stopped at a distance that was slightly too far for comfortable conversation, as if he'd worked out that he wanted to say something but hadn't quite figured out how close to get to say it. "Mara." He had dropped the performative warmth entirely. What was left underneath it was something more real, if less pleasant. A man who was genuinely uncertain about where the ground was. "I need to speak with you." "My union rep has asked me to direct hospital communications through her," Mara said. "I believe your office has her number." "This isn't official communication." He said it quickly. "This is me, personally, speaking to you." A pause. "I received a call at noon from Hargrove's general counsel. I've been advised that the leave decision may need to be revisited." "May need to be. Will be revisited," he said, correcting himself with the look of someone who had been told to use the corrected version and was still getting used to it. "Effective immediately. I've also been informed that the hospital is cooperating fully with federal authorities regarding the security footage and any other materials relevant to what happened." He stopped. Tried again. "I made a decision yesterday morning that I made too quickly." Mara looked at him. He was not comfortable. He was a man who had spent his career making institutional calculations, and this one had been wrong in a way that was now very publicly documented, and he was sitting inside that understanding without an obvious exit from it. She felt no particular satisfaction in this. She felt, if anything, a low-grade exhaustion that was different from tiredness. The specific fatigue of having been required to spend energy defending something that should never have needed defending. "I'll expect written confirmation of the leave revocation through Pat Solano's office," she said. Frey nodded. "You'll have it today." He started to leave. "Douglas." She used his name deliberately. He stopped. "The woman in Denver, the settlement. Did you know about that before last night?" He was very still for a moment. "No," he said. Then, with something that was either honesty or its very good imitation, "I didn't know. I should have asked more questions before I made that call. I didn't." A pause. "That's not an excuse. It's just what happened." She held his gaze until he looked away, and then he walked back toward the administrative corridor, and she watched him go. Pat called it 2:08. Written revocation just came through, Pat said, with the specific energy of someone who has won an argument they expected to have to fight much longer. Administrative leave rescinded effective this afternoon. Full back pay for the period of leave. The formal letter is going to reference a procedural error in the leave authorization process, which is legal language for Frey acting without adequate basis. A pause. That language matters, Mara. It's going to be on the record. What about the assault complaint? That remains with Crestfall PD and is entirely separate from your employment status. Pat's voice was precise. The hospital is not contesting your account of events. That's also in writing. Mara stood at the nursing station and looked at the emergency room, the mid-afternoon rhythm of it. A Tuesday in late winter, the particular quality of light through the big windows, a patient in Bay 3 with her arm elevated, Garrett writing in a chart in the corridor with his pen moving fast the way it did when he was concentrating. "Thank you, Pat," she said, and meant it fully. "That's what I'm here for." A pause. "How are you actually doing?" "I'll let you know when today's finished," Mara said. She hung up. What happened at 2:47 did not come to her by phone. It came through the break room television, which was tuned to a local news station that had spent most of the day running weather segments and a feature on a high school robotics team, and which at 2:47 interrupted its programming with a banner that read, "Breaking" across the bottom of the screen. There were 4 nurses and a respiratory therapist in the break room. They were at various stages of their breaks: coffee, a sandwich, someone's phone showing a half-finished crossword. They all looked up when the programming changed. The banner resolved into a live shot from a camera that appeared to be positioned on a street in Crestfall's downtown business district, the glass and steel building that housed Wolfe Defense Systems regional offices, a building Mara had driven past hundreds of times without considering. The street in front of it had 3 dark SUVs parked at angles that were not parking angles, and there were people in FBI vests on the sidewalk, and the news anchor's voice was saying something about a federal investigation and defense contracting and a prominent local businessman in a tone that had not yet processed what it was narrating. The respiratory therapist said, very quietly, "Oh my God." Nobody corrected her. Mara stood at the back of the break room and watched the screen. The camera caught the moment, not cleanly, at an angle, through a crowd that was gathering on the opposite sidewalk, but it caught it. Preston Wolfe in a coat she recognized from the night before, walking out of the building's glass lobby with 2 FBI agents flanking him and a third behind. He was not in handcuffs yet. That came 10 seconds later, when they reached the first SUV, and one of the agents spoke to him, and he said something back, and the agent's hand went to his arm, and the cuffs came out with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this before and would do it again. His face, caught by the camera for 3 seconds at the wrong angle and then lost again as he was guided into the vehicle, showed something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not the theatrical defiance of a man performing his innocence, something smaller and more real than either, the specific expression of someone who had, in this moment, finally run out of moves. The SUV door closed. The anchor was saying words: federal charges, DOJ investigation, defense contracting fraud, but the room had gone quiet around those words in the same way rooms went quiet around things that were too large to immediately process. Mara looked at the screen for another moment. Then she set down her coffee cup and walked back out to the floor. She had patients to check on. Administratively, she was reinstated. She didn't have a shift until tomorrow night, but she was here, and the floor was here, and there were things that needed doing, and she had always been better at moving than at standing still. She stopped by the consultation room first. Eli was still there. He was not looking at the table anymore. He was looking at his phone, and on his phone was the same news broadcast, live streamed through whatever app he'd found it on, and his face had the particular quality of someone watching something they had known was coming and finding that knowing it didn't make it any easier to see. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I called my aunt," he said finally. "My mom's sister. She's in Denver. She's coming." He paused. "My mom and my dad have been divorced since I was 8. My aunt has... There's a guardianship arrangement for situations like..." He stopped. "I don't know if there are other situations like this, but there's a legal arrangement." "Okay," Mara said. She'll be here by tonight. He was holding the phone in both hands and looking at it. She's a good person. Margaret. She's always been. She's good. Good, Mara said. And then, because it was true and because he had earned it, what you did this morning, Eli, calling Officer Trevino, coming here, that took something real. He shook his head slightly. I mean it, she said. I should have called last night, he said, when it happened. I should have said something right then. He looked at the table. Instead, I sat in a chair and watched them bring him coffee. You're 13. That's what everyone's going to say. It's also true. He looked up. His jaw had the tight line she'd seen before, the one that came from his father's face and expressed something entirely different on his. I don't want it to be an excuse, he said. I made a choice. I made the wrong one, and then I made a better one later. I want to know the difference between those things. Mara looked at this boy and thought that he was going to be all right. Not immediately, not easily, not without the considerable weight of having a father who was now in federal custody pressing on him for years to come. But all right in the way that mattered, which was that he had the internal architecture for it, if someone didn't damage it before it set properly. The difference is real, she said, and you do know it. That's why you're sitting here instead of somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment. When did you know that you were going to do it differently? She thought about it, about a burning convoy and a choice she'd made in approximately 3 seconds that she'd never once second-guessed regardless of the cost. I'm not sure I chose, she said. I think I just was already moving. That seems easier. It wasn't, actually. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, fractional, but it was there. A knock at the door. Byers, with a can of orange juice and a look that communicated without words that things were happening on the floor, and also that he was managing them fine, and also that Mara should not feel obligated to come, but was welcome if she wanted to. She took the juice from him and gave it to Eli and followed Byers out. What's going on? She asked in the corridor. Reporter, Byers said, with the resigned affect of someone naming a category of problem he had encountered before. Local news? Wants a statement about... He gestured vaguely in a direction that covered everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Frey's office is handling it, but the waiting room has people with phones. He paused. The footage from last night is on the internet. Mara stopped. The security footage? No. Someone's personal phone from the waiting room, partial view from when he... Byers stopped. It's been up since about 11 this morning. It's been shared about... He pulled out his phone, showed her a number. She looked at it. Right, he said. So there's that. The number was not small. The number was the kind of number that meant the story had left Crestfall. The story had left Montana. The story was in the particular high-velocity current of the internet, where things moved according to the specific logic of outrage and disbelief, and what people were seeing, what they had been seeing since 11 that morning, was a large man in an expensive suit hitting a woman in scrubs hard enough to knock her sideways in an emergency room, and then grabbing her collar, and then her walking away with blood on her lip, and going through the door to the patient bay without breaking stride. Whatever control anyone had imagined they had over the shape of this story was gone. Mara handed Byers back his phone. Tell Frey's office no statement from nursing staff, she said. All media through the hospital communications office. And make sure nobody goes into the consultation room. Already on it. He pocketed the phone. For what it's worth. He paused and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had a lot to say and had distilled it to its essential element. We're glad you're back. She nodded, moved. The afternoon proceeded with a strange doubled quality. The surface of it was normal emergency room work, the kind that didn't stop for anything because it never did. And underneath that surface was the other thing, the thing running in the background of everyone's awareness like a news feed that nobody could turn off. She checked on a patient. She updated a chart she wasn't supposed to be updating yet because she wasn't officially on shift, but nobody stopped her. She spoke briefly to Officer Trevino, who appeared at 3:45 with a colleague to take a supplemental statement, and who told Mara, in the flat professional tone of someone reporting information rather than editorializing, his attorney attempted to claim Mr. Wolfe was experiencing a medical event at the time of the incident. We have the security footage, we have 17 signed witness statements, we have the urgent care documentation. A pause. The medical event claim isn't going to get much traction. No, Mara agreed. I don't imagine it will. At 4:15, Reyes called. He's in federal custody, Reyes said. You've seen the news. Yes. The CFO's cooperation agreement has been formally accepted. That unlocks about 600 pages of internal financial documentation that the investigation has been building toward for 18 months. Reyes's voice had the quality it got when she was genuinely satisfied with something, which was rare and therefore recognizable. The charges are substantial, Mara. Federal fraud, conspiracy, violations of the False Claims Act. His attorneys are going to push for bail, and they'll probably get it because of his resources. But there are going to be conditions that significantly restrict his ability to operate. What about the board? Board meeting called for tomorrow morning per SEC disclosure requirements given the federal charges. A pause. His position as CEO is going to be largely ceremonial by the end of that meeting, if it survives at all. Mara stood at the window at the end of the east corridor. The parking lot below was darker now, the late afternoon light going fast in the way it did in Montana in winter. She could see the bare tree at the edge of the lot. Reyes, she said. Yeah, the convoy. Does it have to be in the public record? All of it? A pause that was honest. A pause that meant the answer was not the comfortable one. The service record? Yes. That's going to come out as part of the story. It's already coming out. The generals were here this morning, Mara. That's on multiple people's phone cameras. Another pause. The specific operational details are still classified. What people are going to know is the shape of it. Decorated combat veteran, years of service, commendations she never claimed. Not the specifics. Okay, Mara said. Are you okay with that? She thought about it, really considered it, rather than reaching for the easy answer. She thought about the version of herself she'd carried very quietly for 16 years, and the version of herself that was going to be visible now, whether she chose it or not. And she thought about whether those two versions were actually as separate as she'd believed, or whether they had always been, quietly, the same person. I'm working on it, she said. Fair enough. She hung up. At 5:03, she checked on Eli. His Aunt Margaret had called twice and was 4 hours out of Denver. He was still in the consultation room, had consumed 2 cans of orange juice and a packet of crackers that buyers had acquired from somewhere, and was working through something on his phone that turned out to be homework. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him, this boy doing 7th grade homework in a hospital consultation room while his father sat in federal custody, and felt something she couldn't name precisely. It was not uncomplicated. You don't have to stay in here, she said. I know. He looked up. It's quieter. She left him to it. At 5:30, Pat called with the formal written confirmation of the leave revocation. Everything in it was what she'd said it would be. Clean, documented, on the record. At 6:07, her personal phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, local area code. She almost didn't answer. She answered, Ms. Denton. A voice she didn't know, male, careful, with the clipped precision of someone used to speaking in environments where words were expensive. My name is Alan Marsh. I'm a senior partner at Kellerman Marsh. We represent the board of Wolfe Defense Systems. She said nothing. Waited. I want to be direct, he said. Our client, the board, not Mr. Wolfe, is in a position of significant liability exposure given the events of today and of Monday night. Part of our assessment of that liability involves the incident at Hargrove Memorial. A pause. The board is prepared to take significant action in response to what occurred, independently of any federal or criminal proceeding. The purpose of this call is to make sure you're aware that we consider the board's interests and Mr. Wolfe's interests to be, at this point, entirely separate. What does that mean in practice? She asked. It means that when you receive the board's formal communications in the next 72 hours, you should read them carefully. He paused again. It means that the people who run this company are not going to spend their institutional capital defending a man who assaulted a nurse on camera, not given everything else that's now on the table. Mara was quiet for a moment. Mr. Marsh, she said, I'd like you to know that this call, like every other communication related to this matter, has been noted and will be shared with my legal representative. That's entirely appropriate, he said. I expected nothing less. Another pause. Ms. Denton, for what it's worth, what he did was wrong. What this company's internal processes may have enabled, may have failed to prevent, that's going to be part of a very long conversation. But what he did to you specifically in that room, in front of those people. He stopped himself. I have daughters, he said. And then, as if he'd said more than he intended, "Good night, Ms. Denton." He hung up. She stood with the dead phone and thought about Alan Marsh and his daughters, and the specific way that some people discovered where their lines were only after someone else's had already been crossed. And she thought about whether that mattered, and she decided that it did. Imperfectly and inadequately and late, but it did. The evening shift was starting to arrive. She recognized faces, got nods, got a few longer looks that were trying to be subtle and weren't entirely. She was reinstated, but she wasn't on tonight's schedule, and she understood that her continued presence in the building was operating on the social grace of a staff that wanted her there rather than the procedural authorization of a roster. She was putting on her coat in the break room, getting ready to leave, when Garrett appeared in the doorway for the second time that day. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand. "They're having a thing," he said. "Later. Some of the staff, Byers is organizing it. Nothing big, just, he offered the paper. "If you want to know when and where." She took it, looked at it. A time and an address. A bar she knew by name, nothing fancy, the kind of place that had been in the same location for 20 years and had no intention of leaving. "Thank you," she said. "You should know," he said, "that the number on that video, the shares, it's a lot more now than it was this afternoon." She pocketed the paper. "I know. There's something else." He hesitated in the way he had that morning, finding the entry point for something that cost him something. "When I gave my statement to Trevino this morning, she told me something. Off the record, she said Wolfe's legal team had already contacted two of the people who were in the waiting room that night, offering them, she used the word incentivized, to soften their accounts." Mara looked at him. "Two of them took this call," he said, "and then called Trevino back and reported it." He paused. "Witness tampering, on top of everything else." She absorbed this without expression. "Okay," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her steadily. "Okay. Then, get some sleep tonight. You look like you haven't slept." "I slept a little. More than a little," he said, in the tone of someone who was telling her to take care of herself rather than asking. Young, she thought. Young and not entirely sure how to do this yet, but trying in the right direction. She left the break room and walked back through the main bay one more time on her way out. The evening shift was in its early rhythm. The bay had its usual evening population. 3 patients in bays, 2 in the corridor waiting for rooms, a tired family in the waiting area with a teenager who was holding an ice pack to his knee. Normal. The specific normalcy that had been here the night before the slap, and would be here long after all of this had moved into whatever it was going to become. She stopped at the nursing station for a moment. Byers was at the end of his shift, gathering his things. He looked up. "There's something you should see," he said. He turned the monitor on the station toward her. It was the hospital's internal incident tracking system. A fresh entry filed at 3:17 that afternoon. Incident report ID, date and time of occurrence, description of incident. Her name. Wolfe's name. 41 witness names listed in the attached documentation field. She looked at it. Linda Marsh filed it herself, Byers said, the HR director. She backdated the entry to Monday night and noted in the field that the original failure to file a timely incident report was a procedural lapse. He paused. It's official hospital record now, locked into the system. Mara looked at the screen for a long moment. Okay, she said. She was almost at the main exit when her phone buzzed a final time. Not a call. A text from Reyes, sent at 6:49. Board voted. Wolfe removed as CEO effective immediately. Statement going out in the next hour. Assets under federal freeze per court order filed at 4 p.m. She read it standing in the lobby with her coat on and people moving around her. She typed back, "Thank you." She pushed through the main doors into the Montana evening, which was cold and clear and smelled like winter working itself toward spring in the unhurried way that seasons did in this part of the country. The parking lot lights had come on. A few stars were appearing in the east. She was walking toward her car when the call came in on the second unlisted number. Not Ashford, not Reyes. A number that had been in her phone for 16 years untouched, different from the others, the one she had almost called first that night, and then hadn't, for reasons she'd told herself were practical. She stopped in the middle of the parking lot and looked at the screen. She answered, "Denton." The voice was older than she remembered, rougher, but the particular quality of it, the thing underneath the professional register, the thing she had heard once in a field hospital at 2 in the morning when she had been fading in and out and someone had been talking to keep her present, that was the same. "Vasquez," she said. A pause. "I heard it's been a day." "You could say that." "I'm in Denver," he said. "I could be there by morning." She stood in the parking lot in the cold with the lights around her and the stars coming in from the east and thought about Major Luis Vasquez, who she had pulled out of a burning vehicle alongside 3 generals 16 years ago, and who had, unlike the generals, never once tried to find her afterward. Not because he didn't know where she was, she suspected, but because he understood without being told that what she needed most was to not be found, and had given her that. For 16 years. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you called last night," he said. "You didn't call me, but you called, and that means you're done being done." She was quiet for a long moment. The parking lot, the cold, the stars. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Being done being done." "I don't know exactly," he said. "I thought we could figure that out." A pause. "There's something else. I've been sitting on it for a few months trying to work out the right time. There isn't a right time, I've decided, so I'm just going to say it." Another pause, briefer. "There's a position. Joint Federal Civilian Trauma Response Program, embedded with a hospital system in the field. Program Director. It's new. They're still building the framework. They need someone who has done both things, who knows both worlds." He stopped. "Someone sent me your name. I didn't ask who. I have a guess." She thought about Ashford. She thought about Reyes. She thought about the unlisted number that had texted her at 7:45 that morning and told her to be at the hospital. "What's the position?" she asked. "National Director," he said. "Of a trauma response program that doesn't fully exist yet. You'd be building a significant part of it." A pause. "I know that's not how you've been living. I know you've built something here that's yours. I'm just telling you, it exists." The parking lot was very quiet. Mara stood in it with the phone against her ear and the cold working through her coat and thought about Lily Farrow's finger pointing to where it hurt, and Eli Wolfe doing his homework in a consultation room, and Garrett with his empty coffee cup, and Tom Byers with his thermos, and Pat Solano's careful, hedge-free voice when she'd called with the revocation, and the 3 generals in full-dress uniform in the middle of an emergency room in Montana, and 16 years of a choice she'd made and maintained, and that had been, by every measure she had, the right choice and also not the only possible right choice. She thought about the version of herself she'd kept very quiet. She thought about how loud the last 2 days had been. "I need to think," she said. "I know," Vasquez said. "That's why I'm calling tonight and not tomorrow. Take the night." "You'll be in Crestfall by morning?" "If you want me to be." She looked up at the sky. The stars fully visible now, the specific clarity of a Montana winter night that was one of the few things about this place she had loved unreservedly from the beginning. "Yeah," she said. "Come." She hung up and stood there for another moment. Then she got in her car and sat in it without starting it, because there was something she needed to sit with before she drove. Something about the shape of what the next thing was going to look like. Not the job, not the decision, but the fact of being someone whose name was now in the public record attached to a story she hadn't chosen to tell, and that had nonetheless been told, and finding out what she was going to do with that. She sat with it. And then her phone lit up one more time. Not a call, not a text from anyone she'd spoken to today. A notification from a news aggregator she barely used, a local Crestfall station pushing an alert. The headline read, "Wolfe Defense CEO Charged. Federal prosecutors reveal witness list in assault case." She tapped it. The article was brief, early, still being updated. But at the bottom, below the charges and the board vote and the asset freeze in the section labeled Related, was a name she hadn't expected to see yet. Her name. And next to it, a photograph she recognized. It was the photograph from the file she hadn't seen. Herself, 16 years younger, in combat fatigues, her face turned slightly away from the camera, her jaw set. and underneath it, a single line of text that some editor somewhere had pulled from a source she didn't know yet and run without fully understanding what they had. Sources confirmed Denton received the nation's second highest military honor for valor, a decoration she declined to have publicly announced. She stared at it. She had declined the announcement. She had signed the paperwork and put it in a box and moved on. The decoration itself, physical, real, sitting in that box in the back of her closet in a house in Crestfall, Montana, she had not thought about in a long time, had not thought about deliberately, had put it where she put other things that were true and finished. It was not finished. She set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield at the parking lot and the hospital building and the lit windows of a place where, right now, a girl named Lily Farrow was recovering from surgery and a boy named Eli Wolfe was eating crackers and doing homework and waiting for his aunt, and where tomorrow morning Mara Denton would come back to work a night shift on a floor that was hers. She started the car. She drove home through Crestfall's evening streets, and in the back of the closet of her bedroom, in a box she hadn't opened in 16 years, something was waiting for her that the rest of the country was now learning to ask questions about. And in the back of the closet of her bedroom, in a box she hadn't opened in 16 years, something was waiting for her that the rest of the country was now learning to ask questions about. Tim. She didn't open the box that night. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom closet for a long moment, looking at it. A standard military-issue storage box, olive drab, the kind that came in a standardized size designed to fit in standardized spaces. It sat on the top shelf behind a winter coat she rarely wore and a bag of things she'd been meaning to donate for 2 years. She had put it there when she moved into this house, and she had not moved it since. She left it where it was. She made dinner instead, actual food, not the mechanical fuel of the previous night. Eggs and toast and sliced tomatoes because it was what she had, and she'd been running on coffee and adrenaline for almost 40 hours, and her body was making demands she'd been postponing. She ate at the kitchen table without her phone, which was a deliberate choice, and she washed the dishes by hand even though she had a dishwasher, because there was something about the specific activity of her hands in warm water doing something small and completed that she needed. She slept for 7 hours. Not 8, not 6. 7. With one interruption around 3 that lasted 20 minutes and then resolved. When she woke at 6:15, it was still dark, and she lay in bed for a moment in the specific stillness of a morning that didn't have an emergency in it yet and let herself feel what that was like. Then she got up. Luis Vasquez called at 7:08, which meant he was already in Crestfall. "There's a diner on Harmon Street," he said. "I've already ordered coffee. Come when you're ready." "Give me 20 minutes. She was there in 15. He was sitting in a window booth with his back to the wall, which she had expected. He was 52 now, broader through the shoulders than she remembered, with gray at his temples that had not been there when she last saw him, and a face that had done the things that faces did when they moved through decades of difficult work. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, flannel shirt, the deliberate unpretentiousness of someone who had spent enough years in uniform to appreciate being out of one. He stood when she came in, and she noticed that this was not a performance. He'd been half up before he'd finished processing that she'd walked through the door. They looked at each other for a moment. "You look the same," he said. "I look 16 years older," she said. "Same thing." He sat back down. She slid into the booth across from him. The coffee the waitress brought her was strong, and she was grateful for it. "You drove through the night," she said. "I didn't sleep anyway." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I watched the news." "How much of it?" "Enough." A pause. "The footage." She said nothing. "I've been doing this work for a long time," he said, meaning the federal civilian program, the framework he'd described. "I've briefed senators. I've built training protocols. I've sat in rooms with people who had every credential on the wall and none of the actual knowledge. And I've been trying to figure out for 2 years how to make this thing real instead of just administrative." He looked at her directly. "I need someone who has done both, who doesn't need to be convinced that the gap between military medicine and civilian emergency care is real and consequential and costs people their lives. Someone who can design across both systems without falling in love with either one of them." "That's a long way to say you need me specifically." "Yes," he said. "I do." She held his gaze. He had always been direct in a way that was different from bluntness. Not a failure of social calibration, but a deliberate efficiency, the verbal equivalent of not carrying unnecessary equipment. "Tell me about the program," she said. He did. For 40 minutes, over coffee that got refilled twice, he told her about the Joint Federal Civilian Trauma Response Initiative, its structure, its gaps. The 18 months he'd spent trying to fill those gaps with people who were competent in one world and unable to translate into the other. It was federally funded but institutionally new enough that its shape was still being determined, which meant it had both the freedom and the instability of something that hadn't yet calcified into bureaucracy. It needed field protocols. It needed training curriculum. It needed someone who could walk into an emergency room and a military hospital and speak fluently in both spaces and be taken seriously in both. She asked questions. Real ones, the kind that came from actually listening and actually knowing the material. He answered them without spin. Where the program was weak, he said so. Where the funding was uncertain, he named that clearly. He did not try to sell it. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. The diner was filling up with the morning crowd. A Tuesday, people in work clothes, the particular texture of a regular morning in a working town. The window beside them showed Harmon Street waking up, a delivery truck, a woman walking a dog, a man with a travel mug moving fast toward wherever he needed to be. "I built something here," she said. "I know. 6 years. The staff knows me. The floor knows me. There are patients who ask for me by name." "I know," he said again, not dismissing it, holding it as a real thing. "If I took this," she said, "I wouldn't be leaving a job. I'd be leaving a community." "Yes." He paused. "That's a real cost." She looked at the window, the street, the regular morning of a place she'd chosen deliberately and lived inside without apology. "The position is based where?" she asked. "Headquarters in D.C., but it's designed around field presence. You'd be in the field more than the office. Program design would let you build in regional partnerships." He paused carefully. "The Crestfall area has one of the larger rural trauma gaps in the Northwest. That's not a coincidence that I'm mentioning." She looked at him. "I'm not above making a practical argument," he said. "No," she agreed. "You never were." They sat with it for a moment. "Luis," she said, "the box in my closet." He didn't ask what box. "I put it away and I meant it," she said. "I wasn't running from it. I was finished with it." "There's a difference." "I know. The person who earned what's in that box, she's the same person who's been working the night shift in that ER for 6 years. I didn't cut her off. I just got quieter." She paused. "I'm going to have to get less quiet now. That's already happening regardless of what I decide about your program." "Yes," he said. "I'm not sure how I feel about that." "How do you feel about it?" She considered, not the performed version, the real accounting. "Like a door I closed from the inside just got opened from the outside," she said, "which is different from having chosen to open it. But I'm standing in the opening now regardless." He nodded slowly. "Give me until tonight," she said. "You have it." She paid for the coffee. He tried to stop her, and she gave him a look that ended the attempt. And she drove to the hospital for her morning shift, which started at 7:30, and which she was now, in a clean bureaucratic sense, fully authorized to work. The day shift at Hargrove Memorial on a Wednesday morning had a different texture than it had 2 days ago, and she was aware of this without being comfortable with it. People looked at her when she came through the main entrance. Not all of them, not in a crowd-parting way, but in the specific manner of people who had revised their understanding of someone and were still adjusting to the revision. She was the same nurse she had been on Monday night. She was also, to the people who'd seen the footage and read the news alerts, something that didn't have a clean category. A colleague who turned out to have a classified commendation and a connection to 3 generals and 16 years of a life she'd kept compressed. Tom Byers was at the station for the overlap between his early shift and the main morning push. "How's your face?" he asked. She touched her cheekbone. The bruise was fading, yellow-green now, moving toward resolution. The lip was almost healed. "Better?" "Good." He slid a chart across the counter toward her. Bay 4, 63-year-old male, came in at 5 with chest presentation. Attending cleared him for discharge, but something's been bothering me about the rhythm since 6. He tapped the chart. "You know me, I don't second-guess attendings easily." "No, you don't." She took the chart and looked at it. She looked at it for 30 seconds, then looked at the printout he'd flagged. Who's covering cardiology this morning? Nguyen. Get her in here, Mara said. Now, not when she's finished her coffee. Byers got on the phone. Nguyen arrived 7 minutes later, looked at what Mara and Byers had flagged, ordered an immediate 12 lead, and had the patient transferred to the cardiac unit within 40 minutes. He would, she learned the following day, require a stent. The discharge that had almost happened at 6 in the morning would have sent him home in a condition that a cardiologist report would later describe as likely to have resulted in a major event within hours. This was the work. This was what it was. Not the generals, not the cameras, not the federal investigation or the press or the footage or any of it. This was the actual center of gravity of her days. A man in Bay 4 and a rhythm strip that bothered a good charge nurse and 6 years of pattern recognition that said not yet. She worked through the morning. At 11:40, her phone buzzed with a text from Pat. Federal prosecutor's office called. They want to schedule your formal deposition. 2 weeks out. I'll handle the logistics, just confirming you're still willing. She typed back, yes. At noon, she checked on Lily Farrow, who had been moved from surgical recovery to a general pediatric room on the 3rd floor. She hadn't been sure if she'd go. It wasn't her patient in any formal sense, wasn't her floor, wasn't her scheduled responsibility. But she went anyway. Lily was awake. Her color was completely different from Monday night. Pink, present, the specific vitality of a 7-year-old whose body had been given what it needed and was recovering with the speed that children's bodies recovered at, which was its own kind of astonishing. She was watching something on a tablet propped against her knees and eating a cup of red gelatin with the focused attention of someone for whom that gelatin represented significant progress. Her father was in the chair beside the bed. He looked like he had slept, somewhat, in the same chair. He looked up when Mara appeared in the doorway. Hey, he said. Simple. Full. Hey. She looked at Lily. How's Biscuit? Lily looked up from the gelatin. Her face registered Mara's face and rearranged itself into recognition. He's at my grandma's, she said. She says he snores even louder in her house because he's nervous. Nervous dogs snore louder, Mara agreed seriously. That's a medical fact. Lily considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating information. Okay, she said, and went back to the gelatin. Her father stood up and came to the doorway. He was a man of about 40, ordinary-looking in the way that meant she wouldn't have placed him in a lineup, the kind of face that only became distinct once you'd seen the specific quality of love it arranged itself into when looking at his daughter. I saw the news, he said quietly. All of it. A pause. I keep thinking about Monday night, about how you came in and you knew and you moved and none of that. All of that was happening to you at the same time and you still... He stopped himself. I don't know how to finish that sentence. You don't have to, Mara said. She's 7, he said. His voice changed texture slightly, not quite breaking, but doing the thing just before that. She's 7 years old, and she's going to be completely fine because you looked at her for 30 seconds, and you knew. Mara looked at Lily, still occupied with the gelatin and the tablet, wholly unconcerned. That's the job, Mara said. I know. He looked at her. But it wasn't just the job, was it? She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't just the job. She left them there. The court proceedings began 6 weeks later and ran for 11 days. Mara did not watch the coverage in real time. She worked her shifts, she slept, she ate. She went to the bar on Callaway Street twice with a group that included Byers and Garrett and 2 nurses from the 2nd floor, and on the second occasion, Diana Reyes, who was in town for reasons she described only as logistical, and who drank 1 beer and nursed it for 3 hours and talked to everyone with the easy attention of someone who had gotten very good at being present in a room. Mara watched her do this and thought she would be good at anything she decided to do. She thought she'd always known this and had never said it. She said it on the walk back to the parking lot. Reyes looked at her for a moment and said, "So would you," without making it bigger than it needed to be, and they drove home in separate cars in the late Montana cold. The deposition was on a Tuesday. Pat accompanied her. The prosecutor's office was professional and careful, and the questions were specific and detailed and long, and Mara answered them the way she answered everything, sequentially, without embellishment, at the clean border of what she knew and didn't know. It took 4 hours. She was tired afterward in a way that was different from physical tiredness, the particular fatigue of having been very precise for a very long time. On the last day of testimony, Preston Wolfe took the stand. She was there. She had not planned to be there, but Reyes had texted her the night before, closing tomorrow. You should be in the room. And she had driven to the federal courthouse in a city 2 hours from Crestfall and sat in the gallery in the same dark jeans and gray sweater she'd been wearing the morning the generals came, because she hadn't thought to bring anything else. The courtroom was smaller than television made courtrooms look. The light was flat and bureaucratic. The gallery was perhaps a third full. Press, several members of the Wolfe Defense Board, a few faces she didn't know, and 2 she did. Reyes was near the back. Ashford was not there in person, but she learned later that he had watched on a secure feed from somewhere she was not told. Wolfe had aged in 6 weeks. It was not a dramatic transformation. He still wore the suit, still carried himself with the residual confidence of someone for whom that confidence had been structural for decades. But something underneath it had shifted. He was a man who had spent his adult life in rooms where he controlled the weight distribution, and he was now in a room where he did not, and his body had not yet learned how to be comfortable in that. His attorney did what good attorneys did: managed, constructed, argued from the strongest available position with professionalism and persistence. But the evidence was what Reyes had described months ago. 600 pages of financial documentation, the CFO's cooperation agreement, 17 witness statements from the emergency room, Garrett's account, Eli's account, Officer Trevino's detailed contemporaneous notes, 3 security camera angles, and documentation from an urgent care clinic showing the injuries sustained by a nurse whose employment the hospital had suspended within hours of her being assaulted. The forensic accountant, who testified on day 7, spent 3 hours walking through a billing structure so deliberately complex that its complexity was itself evidence. No legitimate business needed that architecture, and the jury understood this without needing it explained twice. Mara sat in the gallery and watched Preston Wolfe on the stand, and thought about Monday night and the weight of his hand and the specific certainty in his voice when he said, "Know your place," and she tried to feel something large about it and found that what she actually felt was smaller and more human than she'd expected. Not triumph, not closure, which was a word she had always suspected of being more useful in description than in experience. Something closer to the feeling she got when a long shift ended and the floor was stable and the patients were accounted for and she could hand it off and walk out into the air. Not the absence of something, but the completion of something. A thing that had needed to happen and had happened. The jury was out for less than 2 days. She heard the verdict at work. Someone had a phone at the nursing station. Against policy, technically, but Byers was not in a position to pretend he wasn't interested. And the notification came in and traveled through the floor in the specific rapid osmosis of news that people have been waiting for. Guilty on 14 of 16 counts. Federal fraud. Conspiracy. False Claims Act violations. Obstruction. The witness tampering, documented and prosecuted with an efficiency that had, by all accounts, surprised even Wolfe's defense team. The 2 counts that didn't land were technical, jurisdictional issues the prosecutor had known about going in and had flagged as uncertain. 14 of 16 was not a compromise, it was a verdict. She went back to the patient she was with. A woman in her 50s with a dislocated shoulder and understandable opinions about it. Mara got her settled and her pain managed and her daughter called and the shoulder dealt with, and then she stood in the corridor for a moment and let herself take one full breath. That was all she gave it right there. One breath. The rest of it would be there when the shift was done. Wolfe was sentenced 8 weeks later to 14 years in federal prison. His attorneys immediately filed for appeal, which everyone expected and which the prosecutor's office had prepared for with the same thoroughness they'd brought to the original case. The appeal would take time. The sentence was real and it was documented and it was, in the specific language of the court, proportional to the scale and duration of the harm. His assets were not merely frozen, but substantially forfeited, a process that took additional months but produced eventually a number that the DOJ press release described as the largest single recovery in a False Claims Act case involving defense contracting in the district's history. The board of Wolfe Defense Systems had, in the intervening months, cooperated extensively with federal oversight and undergone a governance restructuring so complete that the company that emerged from it shared almost nothing with the one that had existed before except the name, and even that was under internal discussion. Douglas Frey resigned from Hargrove Memorial 6 weeks after the verdict. The resignation letter cited personal reasons, which was accurate in the way that things were accurate when they left out the majority of the explanation. Linda Marsh, the HR director, was appointed interim administrator. She moved competently and without drama and turned out to be exactly what an institution needed after a period of crisis. Not a fixer, but a steadier, someone who understood that the work of repair was slower and less visible than the work of damage. The formal institutional recognition came in the form of a hospital board resolution passed on a Thursday afternoon in March, which Mara was informed of by email and which she read at the nursing station between patients. It cited her service, her conduct, her role in patient care, and, specifically, in language that Linda Marsh told her later she had drafted herself, her decision to prioritize a pediatric patient over the demands of a high-status visitor, and the outcome that decision produced. She read it once, filed the email in a folder, went back to work. What was harder to file was what happened 2 days later, when she came in for an evening shift and found, taped to her locker, a piece of paper that had clearly been signed in stages over the course of the day, names in different inks, some careful and some rushed, covering both sides of the page. 63 signatures, every day shift nurse on the floor, every attending who had been in the building that day, Garrett, Byers, the respiratory therapist from the break room, the security guard whose name she had never learned, and who had apparently learned hers. A few names she didn't recognize, which meant they had circulated it wider than she knew. At the top, in Byers's handwriting, it said, "We know who you are. We always did. We just thought you should hear it." She stood at her locker and looked at it for a long time. She did not cry. She was not generally a crier, but she stood there for longer than she would have liked to admit. And when she closed the locker and turned around, Garrett was at the end of the corridor pretending to look at a chart and not managing to look like he was looking at a chart. And she said, "Thank you," loud enough to carry, and he nodded without looking up. The national coverage peaked, and then, as national coverage did, moved on to other things. The story had its moment, the footage, the generals, the decorated veteran working a night shift. And it lived in the specific way that some stories lived, passed around in certain corners of the internet for longer than the news cycle by people who found it meaningful for their own reasons. She did not engage with any of it directly. She gave one interview, at Pat's strong recommendation and after considerable internal deliberation, to a journalist at a long-form outlet whose work she had read and trusted. The interview ran 6,000 words. It was accurate, careful, and treated her as a person rather than a symbol, which had been her condition for agreeing to it. In it, she said one thing that traveled farther than the rest. "I didn't do anything that night that I hadn't been trained to do and had been doing for 6 years. The only thing that changed was who was watching." She meant it as something smaller than the way people took it. But she understood, reading the responses, why it landed the way it did. Because there were people for whom the experience of being competent and invisible and then suddenly visible only because something bad had happened was not abstract. She had not intended a statement. She had said what was true. Sometimes those were the same thing. Eli Wolfe moved to Denver with his Aunt Margaret 3 weeks after his father's arrest. He called Mara once from a number she didn't recognize in February. He said he was doing okay. He said school was different but not bad. He said Margaret's house had a dog, a large indeterminate breed who was not fat and did not snore, which was a point of comparison he offered without explanation and which she found she understood completely. He said, "I don't know if this is weird to say, but I think about that conversation a lot. The one in the consultation room, about the difference between the two choices." "It's not weird," she said. "I've been trying to make the better choice earlier," he said, "in small stuff. It's harder than I thought it would be." "It's always harder than it looks," she said. "That doesn't mean it gets easier, it means you get stronger." A pause. "Okay," he said, like he was writing it down somewhere. They didn't speak again, but she thought about him more than she would have predicted. Not with worry exactly, but with the specific kind of attention she gave to things that were still in process, still becoming whatever they were going to become. The program position was still open in March. She had told Vasquez she needed time, and he had given it, and they had talked twice more over those weeks, once by phone, once when he came through Crestfall on what he called a site visit, and she called what it obviously was, which was checking on her. They had coffee at the same diner on Harmon Street and talked about the program's current state and about Crestfall's specific position in the regional trauma gap, and about what it would actually mean in practice if the program's first field partnership was established here. "You're building an argument," she said. "I'm presenting facts," he said. "Those are the same thing when you do it." He almost smiled. He had a good smile, not wide, not performed, the kind that arrived because it had to and stayed only as long as it needed to. She had forgotten that about him, and remembered it now in the specific way you remembered something true about a person when you were in their actual presence rather than your memory of them. "What do you want, Mara?" he asked. "Not what makes sense. What do you want?" She looked at her coffee. She thought about what she wanted. The actual accounting, not the polished version. She wanted to keep working the floor. She also wanted to build something. She wanted the specific knowledge she had accumulated over 16 years of two completely different lives to mean something beyond its daily application, to have a structural impact that outlasted any individual shift or patient or decision. She wanted Crestfall to not disappear from her life. She also wanted the part of herself that had been compressed and quiet for 16 years to be given something adequate to do with itself. Those were not incompatible things. She'd been acting as if they were. She'd been acting as if the choice between the person she'd been and the person she'd become was binary. As if picking up what she'd set down required setting down what she'd built. But she'd been looking at it through the logic of departure, and it was not a departure. It was an expansion. "Yes," she said. Vasquez looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "I'll take the position." He was quiet for a moment, not celebratory. He understood what it had cost to arrive here. "Okay," he said. "The first field partnership is in Crestfall," she said. "That's not negotiable." "It was already on the proposal," he said. "Good." She shook his hand across the table. He held it a second longer than a handshake required, and she let him, because some things were worth that additional second, and this was one of them. She told buyers on a Tuesday morning in April. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do you start?" 6 weeks. He nodded slowly. "Is the program based here at all?" "It's going to be. That's part of what I'm building." He looked at the nursing station, at the floor, at the particular geography of a space that had been his professional home for 11 years and hers for 6. "You're not gone then," he said. "You're just—" He looked for the word. "Bigger." "That's one way to put it," she said. He put his hand out. She shook it. He pulled her into a brief, slightly awkward hug that was more genuine than graceful and that she returned fully. "Don't let them make you administrative," he said, releasing her. "You're too good for administrative." "I'll try." "No trying. Don't let them." "Okay," she said. "I won't." Her last shift at Hargrove Memorial before transitioning to the program was a Thursday night, and she had not told anyone it was her last shift because she didn't want a thing made of it. She worked 12 hours. She triaged a man with a kidney stone who was not understating his distress. She assisted with a pediatric fever that resolved cleanly. She ran a code blue at 2 in the morning alongside Dr. Nguyen and 2 other nurses that lasted 11 minutes and ended with a pulse, which was not the guaranteed outcome, and which they all stood with for a moment in the specific wordless aftermath of a code that went the right way. She handed off at 7:15 to the day shift nurse, a woman named Sarah who had been at Hargrove for 2 years and who was going to be very good and probably already knew it. She walked out through the main bay. At the nursing station, Byers was already there for his shift, which he had apparently come in early for. He said nothing. He just looked at her with the steady, unremarkable steadiness of a person who was going to be fine and wanted her to know it. She nodded. She walked to the main entrance, and the emergency room did something she didn't expect. They stood up. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with coordination. One person rose, then another, then the staff at the station, then Garrett, who had absolutely no reason to be on shift this early and had clearly come in for this specific purpose. The day shift nurses. A janitor in the corridor who stopped his cart and straightened. 2 patients in the waiting area who had no idea what they were standing for, but stood anyway because the room was standing and it felt like the right thing. She stood at the entrance and looked at them. She did not give a speech. She was not a speech person, and this room knew it. She said, "Take care of the floor." Then she walked out through the sliding doors into an April morning in Crestfall, Montana, where the mountains were still carrying their winter snow in the high places, and the air had the specific quality of a cold that was loosening at its edges, the cold of a season changing its mind. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Hargrove Memorial and looked at the sky. There was a thing she had learned in a burning vehicle 16 years ago, in a moment she had never been able to fully describe to anyone because language was inadequate to the specific compression of it. A thing about the relationship between what you feared and what you were capable of. About the fact that most people spent their lives at a careful distance from the outer boundary of themselves, maintaining a comfortable margin between who they were and who they might have to be, and that this was reasonable and human and largely right. And about what happened on the occasions when that margin collapsed entirely, and you found out, with no preparation time, what you actually were. She had found out in a burning vehicle, and she had carried the knowledge quietly for 16 years and kept it away from the surface of her daily life because the daily life was also real, was also hers, was also worth everything she had put into it. What the last 6 weeks had shown her, slowly, imperfectly, through a bruised face and a federal investigation and 3 generals in a Montana emergency room and a 13-year-old doing homework in a consultation room, was that you didn't have to keep those things separate. That the person who had run into the fire and the person who had spent 6 years learning the names of her patient's dogs were not in tension. They were the same person, operating at different volumes. She had just turned the volume up. Preston Wolfe was in federal custody, awaiting transfer to a minimum security facility, his empire dismantled by the CFO who decided cooperation was better than loyalty to a man who had never extended the same consideration in return. His attorneys were filing papers. The papers would take years. The outcome of those years was not certain. But what was certain was that he had stood in a federal courtroom and heard 14 counts read aloud and watched the jury foreman not look at him when he announced them. That had happened. No amount of appellate procedure could unhappen it. Lily Farrow was in 2nd grade with a dog named Biscuit, who snored, and a scar on her abdomen she would have her whole life, and the complete absence of any memory of how serious it had been, which was exactly right. Eli Wolfe was in Denver trying to make the better choice earlier, struggling, mostly succeeding, in the specific unglamorous way that real change worked. Not a transformation, just a day-by-day accumulation of small decisions that added up to something over time. Diana Reyes was somewhere doing classified things she would not describe, which was also exactly right. Luis Vasquez was in D.C. at a program office, waiting for the person he'd driven through the night to convince to build something. And Mara Denton was standing in front of a hospital she had worked in for 6 years with a box in her closet she still hadn't opened, and a new position that would require her to open it publicly and professionally and without apology. And she understood that the box would still be there tonight, and she would open it then, or she would open it tomorrow, or she would open it on a day that didn't have a calendar appointment for it. And what was inside it would be the same regardless of when she did. She was not afraid of it. She had thought she might be, standing in the closet doorway that first night, but she had been wrong. What she felt was something closer to readiness. Not the performed confidence of someone trying to believe they were ready, but the actual physical state of a person who has done the preparation, knows where she is in the landscape, and understands that the next step is simply the next step. She thought about something she had almost said to Eli in the consultation room and hadn't, because the conversation had moved before she could. She would write it to him someday, she thought, not as advice, but as something she had learned herself and was still learning. That the people who dismiss you are counting on your silence. They are counting on you not knowing your own weight. They are counting on the gap between what they see and what you are. And they have spent considerable effort making sure that gap works in their favor. And what you do about that, not in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones, the ones that come before anyone is watching. That is the actual architecture of who you are. She had been quiet for 16 years. Quiet was not the same as small. She had known what she was. She had simply kept it at the volume that fit her life. The life was changing its volume now. She walked to her car. She drove through Crestfall in the April morning, through streets she had driven through 1,000 times, past the diner on Harmon Street and the coffee shop on Callaway, and the urgent care clinic on Delaney, and the bar where the staff had gathered on a Tuesday night, and Reyes had nursed 1 beer for 3 hours. past the mountains that were still doing what mountains did, indifferent and permanent and present. She drove home. She made coffee. She went to the closet. She took the box down. She opened it. Inside, nested in the original velvet-lined case the way it had been placed the day she received it, and had not been moved since, was the decoration she had never publicly claimed. She had earned it in a field she no longer worked in, for an action that had lasted 11 minutes under fire, an action that had felt at the time not like valor, but like arithmetic, the only possible series of moves available in the time she had. 11 minutes. 3 generals and a major, and no one else close enough to do what needed doing. She lifted it out of the case, held it in both hands. It was heavy in the way that metal was heavy. It was real in the way that most things that mattered were real. Not large, not dramatic, just solid and specific and undeniable in the palm of the hand. She had set it away at 23, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had needed to stop being the person who'd earned it in order to become the person she needed to become next. And she had become her. She had become her completely, and now she needed both. She held it for a long moment. Then she set it on the kitchen table where she could see it, and she poured her coffee, and she sat down. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings did in Montana. Imperfectly, beautifully, cold in the shade and warm in the sun. Neither fully one thing nor the other, doing the difficult work of becoming what it was going to be. She drank her coffee. She looked at the decoration on her kitchen table. She thought, I know what I am. She had always known. She had just been waiting, without realizing it, for the moment when knowing it and showing it were no longer two different things. That moment was now. It had always been going to be now. She finished her coffee. She put the decoration back in its case. She packed it in the bag she was taking to D.C. the following Monday. She washed the mug. She looked out the kitchen window at Crestfall in the morning. Then she got on with her day. There are people in your life who have decided what you are before you opened your mouth, who have looked at where you stand and decided how far you can go, who have mistaken your silence for smallness and your patience for surrender. They are counting on you not knowing your own weight. They are counting on the version of you that stays exactly where they put you. What I've learned, not from watching other people, but from standing inside it, is this. Quiet is not the same as gone. Stillness is not the same as stopped. And the moment someone mistakes your restraint for your limit, the entire architecture of their assumption begins to fail. You don't have to prove yourself loudly. You don't have to announce your worth before they'll see it. You just have to keep being what you are, in full, without apology, for long enough that the truth can't be argued with. The truth always catches up. Sometimes it takes 16 years, sometimes it takes 2 days, but it catches up. And when it does, the people who told you to know your place will find out, finally, exactly what place that is.